Microcosm by Kenneth Smith, the book that David and I are going to publish of Kenneth Smith's articles that he published, as magazine column installments back in 1998 through 2000 or so. And the premise of this book is that if we only ever have one worldview in our heads, the one that we grew up in, then we're slaves because we only see the world from a very limited perspective. The world is very big, it's very complex, it's multidimensional, and human beings are very small and mortal and finite. And so any mortal perspective is too limited to do justice to the world. And so how do you learn to develop the ability to pull your head out of the worldview that you were born into and move it into a different worldview, really alien worldview that gives you a completely different angle on reality? And one of the answers, which he proposes in this book, is that we can study the ancient worldview and learn how different it is from the modern one and practice looking at the world from that perspective. And if we get really good at it, we can get to the point where we could even have the two hats and put them on and take them off and hold an argument. We could say, so what would Heraclitus have to say to Carl Sagan if they got into an argument about the nature of man and God and nature? And you should be able to role play both sides and do them justice with neither of them being a caricature, both of them really representing a modern perspective versus an ancient perspective. And of course, the middle perspective that we're going to do, I think about a month and a half from now, we're getting there, is the medieval perspective. So we'll end up with three. We'll walk away with three. And with that amount of practice, Kenneth is confident that that should give us the ability to then go forth into the world and seek out other worldviews and learn not to believe that one worldview holds all the answers, which is very hard for moderns to believe. Moderns believe the modern worldview holds all the answers, and all the other worldviews are bad ones. They're primitive versions, they're erroneous versions, but they're bad, and we're the good, and that's the way it should be. And that which we're born into, that assumption about the superiority and really omniscience of the modern worldview is the trap that all moderns are born into. That's why we're among the various ways in which we're slaves to the assumption that we know it all. And if I don't personally know it all, I assume some other expert somewhere knows it all. And if nobody knows it all today, we assume that the modern world, if it continues, which of course we think it will forever, then tomorrow or the day after, we'll be curing cancer any moment now, and then shortly after that, we'll cure death and we'll all live forever, and then we'll get in spaceships and we'll fly through the universe and we're really gods. Is sort of the subtext of the modern assumption about its own superiority to every other possible worldview. So at this point, with 98 weeks behind us, we've spent a lot of time going through the ancient worldview, which is our topic. This is chapter 4 of the book. I put a link into the chat. We're in section G. The last section will be H, and we're almost done with G. We're coming up. We'll make some good progress on this today. So we've been building up piece by piece the different components that make up the ancient worldview. And each of these components is something Kenneth Smith selected as a part of the ancient worldview that's radically different from the modern worldview. And by radically, I mean all the way down to the root of how the world is seen in that piece of the worldview. We've talked about how they saw nature differently than we saw nature. They see human beings differently from how we see human beings. They saw the sacred and the divine as being different from the way we see those things. They saw the way that how you decide how to structure society, how you decide how to make political decisions, radically different from the way that we think you're supposed to do those things. And what we've discovered is in each case, they're not a primitive or broken or erroneous version of our worldview. They have their own coherent reasons for seeing the world the way that they do. And in some cases, we can look and point and say, I see an error that they've made. I see a mistake that they've made. But in other cases, as we get to know the ancient worldview better, we find ourselves in the uncomfortable position of being able to start to notice places where we're the ones that suffer by comparison. Our ideas about free will versus determinism are like childish. They're like kindergarten level ideas compared to the level of sophistication that the ancients routinely held. So for Fei Wuling asks in the chat, who are we? We all have different worldviews. And of course, the premise of the book is, yes, we are all individuals, but we're all individuals who grew up at this time in the world and on this planet. So none of us has the worldview of what it's like to be a native of Jupiter. We share that in common. None of us have ever lived there. None of us has the worldview of what it is to be a plant. We're all animals. So we all share the animal part of the worldview. And if we keep ticking down this list, we'll discover that the idea that we're all absolutely unique snowflakes with nothing in common whatsoever completely collapses. It's obviously not true. We share an enormous amount in common in our worldviews, despite the things that we differ on. And those things that we have in common are what Kenneth Smith describes as the modern worldview. So the modern worldview doesn't say you're a Xerox copy or a clone of some abstract generic worldview. It says the modern worldview is your starting position that you're born into. And as you grow throughout life and you have experiences and they shape your individual worldview distinctly from that, nevertheless, those are your roots that you grew out of. Whereas an inhabitant of ancient Athens grew up with very different roots from the roots that we have, and they saw the world very differently. The same would be true of China in the year 500 BCE. That would be different still from either of those two worldviews. But Kenneth Smith's not a China expert. He hasn't tried to describe the ancient Chinese worldview in this book. We leave that as an exercise for the student. So that's the premise on the worldviews. The question is about the Hegelian zeitgeist. What is the spirit of the age we live in that defines the things that we start out having in common? And part of why that's useful is even if you rebel against some piece of the modern worldview, which I've done, which I think probably everybody on this call could list some things in which they're atypical. They've broken away from, there's some things that most moderns believe that you don't believe or that I don't believe. Even in that case, the fact that that's what we're rebelling against defines us. Even our acts of rebellion are framed according to what is the dominant assumption that we're pushing off from. And an ancient inhabitant of Sparta or Athens or Corinth would have been pushing off something different, and that would have caused them to develop in a different way. So it's a useful exercise to go through. I guess before we hit the text, we'll start with the comments that we have already. So Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'll first begin, but just quickly mention the mystery of 98. I wonder whether that's just a mystery or whether you knew that we're in week 98 and he wrote this in 1998. So you're being very, very coy. I'll begin there. Uh, I recommended this movie a lot because it shows the ambiguity of existing in the contemporary world. I know David showed it. The movie is Wan Kwai Wei's movie, In the Mood for Love. We're trapped in this ambiguous situation of forbidden love. Uh, you can manifest it in a broader way than just, falling in love. And so this couple was in a strange situation in which uh, their wife and their husband, the partner's husband, they were fallen in love with. They had a kind of affair with each other, and uh, the contemporary people started to wonder how those people fell in love because the people they were married to fell in love and they enacted that, and they eventually fell in love with themselves, but they knew that there was a forbidden love. But nonetheless, the situation and existence meant they, even though they didn't want to, they want to avoid that. They nonetheless did fall in love, and it's a very very beautiful story. How to, on the one hand, let the love mature and grow on its own, or to deny it because it's forbidden, because they didn't want to break the social rules. And in some sense, the guy moved out. He moved to Thailand, and then the final scene, which I actually missed myself, but that was very interesting. He finally decided he need to break away from that, and he whispered into this hole in a temple at Angkor Wat that he loved her, but it would never consummate itself. And This was a secret between him and God. And the scene that I missed and I misunderstood was that in that scene, there was a Buddhist monk. And you could see the last scene, the Buddhist monk was seeing all of this. So the third element came in, that there was a kind of divine presence, in a sense, witnessing that he confessed that, that he lived in samsara, and that's the way things were. So there was a triangle relationship between their love for each other and the forbiddenness of society, and Buddha was watching. that was that was very interesting. It fits right into the story we're telling, because you're going to be telling that Yahweh is watching. In a sense, so it's a very I really highly recommend that movie, because it really tells you about at least the current contemporary condition of existing, how we exist in this sort of multifactorial world, that we have desires and we have social constructions and we have a kind of spiritual dimension that also must go silent, that governs us, existence as well. So I recommend that. Thank you, David, for showing, even though I didn't show up because I couldn't. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. That was In the Mood for Love. That was the name of yeah, I put the link there in the chat to the Wikipedia article for people who want to follow up. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, well, you're raising this question again, this modern view of the world. Now, this is our modern enlightenment, more or less, isn't it? Suddenly, we woke up at some point. When was it? Was it the 17th century, late 17th century or something like that? We suddenly realised that we had the clear vision and those before us had clouded eyes. Now, I'm curious about this. I love, for example, the history of naval ships. You have the history of British naval ships in the 16th century. They would build their gunships and cover them with artworks. On the outstanding principle, if you're going out to die somewhere, you might as well go in style. And in the very early 18th century, this was objected to greatly, and this was curtailed. And they said you can have a bit of artwork on the front and a bit of artwork on the back. Nothing in between. It costs too much money. It's silly. It's nonsense. And they also categorised the nature of their naval ships. They said, this is what a 20-gun ship is. You start here and you end here. Anything outside that is not a 20-gun ship. We don't know. We don't really understand what a 20-gun ship is. But we've defined it in various ways. And it starts here and it stops there. Category, bang. I think it's a bit like your law of the excluded middle. 30-gun ship and the 40-gun ship, and everything's beautifully categorised. But this move was already there. If you look back to the court of Queen Elizabeth, of course, this was a time when the court involved itself in art, in poetry. The dandies went in looking good, trying to attract the attention of the Queen, reciting poetry about what countries they were going to conquer for her. But there was the little bureaucrat, the little bean counter was there waiting in the wings, the Cecils of the world, who must have objected to these great dandies no ends. But there we had our mingy vision that was going to become the practical outlook, which was going to dispel all the nonsense. The bean counters grew. They were already there in the wings. They were growing in numbers until the point, by the early 18th century, they were rising to power. But they were also calling themselves the Enlightenment. I suppose I'd really love something that could outline this aspect of the Enlightenment, this possibly mistaken worldview that we've we've gotten out of the cave, we've looked up and we've seen the sun. We suddenly realise what's going on, and this was us for the first time in history. It'd be interesting if I could see some small literate works which covered this sort of subject that you might have at hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. You know, it's a question that has an incredibly complicated answer for a lot of reasons. I put a series of links to Pico della Mirandola, who we've talked about, Renaissance, Age of Enlightenment, the Reformation, Age of Discovery. I think Sharon was the first one to posit this question about almost maybe 2 years ago. My God, we start talking about the modern world, and she's like, "Well, when does the modern world begin?" And we're like, "Well, it's complicated." And the reason it's complicated is that, you know, if the Hegelian model of history is correct, then our ages don't develop like mathematical sets or categories with clear boundaries between them. They develop like organisms develop. And, you know, what is the point at which, you know, I became smart, you know, or what is the point at which I became aware of my responsibilities as an adult, as a person, or any other part of my development? It's always going to be that, well, it happened in stages over time. There wasn't like a point before which I had nothing and a point after which I had everything. The same is true for the boundary between medievalism and modernism, that, you know, the center of medievalism and the center of modernism, when they're each at their peak, they're clearly different from each other in so many ways. But the more you move away from the peaks towards the boundaries between them, the more like each other they begin to look, until eventually, you know, there's this complicated period in between where there's a lot of both. And even to this day, there's a lot of both. I mean, in the United States, there's a very strong theocratic movement that wants to put God back in the schools, God back in the government. They basically want to return to the 1400s when, you know, it was a theocracy. The goal was theocratic government. And this argument is made frequently in US politics, and it's passionately received, both by people who absolutely believe that if we would just return to the hypocrisy and corruption of the late medieval period, there wouldn't be any hypocrisy or corruption this time. It would be perfect. Because for whatever reason, their unstated argument is, who knows why God allowed, you know, the rule of God in the medieval period to become corrupted by the end of that period. But he wouldn't do that now. Now he feels differently. They know, right? They read his mind. And if we were to go back and try to repeat the experiment of having, you know, God-driven governments, this time there wouldn't be any corruption. And so there's this, you can see even
with a little modification, of course.
Of course, they always want a few modifications.
We're having the Reformation, and then, of course, the nonconformist movement against the Reformation, because the
Yes.
Reformation reinstituted the centralised church in the form
Yes.
of the national churches.
Yes.
And of course, the nonconformists said, hey, I thought we were all going to have our own individual telephone to God.
Right. Right.
You've made a state telephone. And well, Sweden's a beautiful example.
Yes.
Sweden banned people from having religious meetings at home, except in the case of where it was their family.
Yes. Yes.
You're a criminal if you actually held a religious meeting outside the church.
That's right. None of that house church
This
stuff.
is when we talk about the United States, the United States was founded by these nonconformists.
Crazy.
And so we have to think about the attitude of the medieval church that,
that's right.
Okay, yes and no. It is an element of the medieval church, but something's changed.
So yeah, what we're seeing here basically as we look at this is that even deep into late modernity, there are still people who haven't given up the medieval perspective. They want to return to it. Now, of course, if they found themselves dropped into 1400 Europe, they would be shocked to discover that what they imagine it to have been like is completely different from what it actually is, because they don't understand that they're not actually theocrats in the original medieval sense. They're moderns who are longing for in an escapist way. They're longing for their fantasy of medievalism, which is of course a modernity with a little bit of set dressing change. They don't know how deep the change would actually go if they went there. But the point is, they still look back, and there's still this longing, and this is long after we've passed the peak of modernity. So all of these roots and tendrils of development and growth cross completely from one epoch into the next. But despite that fact, we can point to a number of inflection points. We can say, Mirandola, in his attempt to rescue what he sees as the flaws in the theology that he was born into, tries to fix it with a few patches to make sure that God isn't held responsible for things he doesn't want them to be held responsible for. And in the course of that, he accidentally foreshadows some aspects of the modern worldview and of course, he pays for it with his life later. The Renaissance, of course, is the period where as the influx of translated, Greco-Latin works that came via the Arabs come back into Europe, Europe discovers that its standing in the 1300s and 1400s technologically and scientifically is backwards of what it used to be in the 500s, 400s, 300s, 200s BCE. And they're astonished to discover that their ancestors used to do all these things. And it causes a huge change, a sea change in attitudes towards the present and the past. Instead of the complacency of thinking, well, all those past people were all heathens and pagans, but now we're the enlightened ones because, we're working under God. They began to go, well, if we're so enlightened, how come we can't do half the things that our Roman forebears used to do? And so this attitude towards the present began to change into one of, we have to go back to the distant past and dig back up what was lost. We want to be born again into the science and technology that we once had. And that causes a rejection of a lot of core values that defined the medieval epoch. It starts to shake things up on an epistemological level, at really deeply. But I think the real clincher when you talk about the way that we feel about these things, the real clincher is the Reformation. Is when the point at which Protestantism arises, it arises as a direct rejection of the medieval church. All of the other ways in which the transition happened, from medievalism to modernity, they were trying to coexist and work around the medieval. Like scientists were trying not to get in trouble. But Martin Luther walks up to the door and nails his damn theses to the door. He is looking for trouble, right? He is directly confronting the existing order and saying, you suck. You're corrupt. You promised, right? The medieval promise was that it would put an end to the corruption of Rome. And instead, the Romans could only dream of being as corrupt as the papacy was in the 1400s. So he's like, screw this. I'm going to directly confront it. That was when the attitude became, rather than defining the medieval epoch as the superior and holy epoch, between that and the Renaissance, it began to be defined as the inferior, ignorant, backwards, corrupt epoch. And it led to a sea change of attitudes and a real rejection and push off against the period. All the values became inverted in a classic Hegelian dialectical way. The things that previously had been praised, they began to be, censured as containing terrible, vicious qualities that had been overlooked until that point. And the overreact, as typically happens with these revolutions, there was an overreaction, even things that were good about the medieval period. And there were things. This is my historical period that I study. There were many things about the medieval period that were better than people typically think they were. But yeah, there was a lot, when you're throwing out, the bathwater, the baby often goes as well. So at this point, moderns largely defined themselves in antagonism to the medieval period and its values, in the same way that the medieval period defined itself antagonistically against the ancient period and its values. Very consciously, if the medieval period was the Dark Age, we define ourselves as the Enlightened Age, the age of discovery, the age of information. At every turn, the way that we name ourselves makes clear our contempt for our immediate forebears in the medieval epoch.
Okay, we're using a new set of categories as well.
Yes.
New categories have evolved. But the
Yes.
problem, as with Oedipus, is you come along with your new clever categories,
Yes.
but they are generalizations and they work very nicely, but unfortunately you miss a few things.
That's right.
And the new categories create a type of blindness that wasn't there before.
Yes. Yes. And you can see it even in the 1700s. You can see it in the Declaration, U.S. Declaration of Independence, and Constitution. When you put them together as a pair of documents, all men are created equal. And by all men, we mean no women, no men who don't own their own large farms, no black people, no indigenous people, really
No
a
Catholic.
tiny group of people are defined as the ones who are all equal, and everybody else is not. And so there's this way in which the categories are being played with. There's like this conscious redefinition of the meaning of man and God and nature and everything else that's taking place over a course of centuries from the 1400s through the
How did they
1700s.
define the criminal under all
Right,
men?
right. What counts as a criminal. And you see the exact same thing happening in France around the French Revolution. They got so into redefining everything, they decided to abandon the week. They wanted a base 10 week. They're like, we're redefining everything without thinking about, well, is a base 10 week really practical for dividing up a month when a month is actually the moon going around the earth? You can try to divide it by 10, but you're going to end up with awkward fractions, whereas 7 goes pretty well into 28 or 28 point something. So there is this way in which, during peak modernity, which might be from the 1700s through the 1900s, during that period, we really struggled with the problem of overreach in our definitions and categories of things. By the late 20th century, we're starting to retreat from our more extreme positions. I often think that the classic statement of modernity is the mid 20th century behaviorist psychology, which says that, first of all, animals don't have minds or feelings or any value whatsoever. They're just objects like apples or hammers. We can do whatever we want with them. And then that gets extended by the behaviorists into even people don't have a mind or a character or anything. They're really just a machine. Their brain is a computer. And, with operant conditioning, you can reprogram them to be whatever you want them to be. And they absolutely believed this in the mid 20th century. They were 100% confident that with the right education and shall we say, motivations, they could turn anybody into anything. And the second half of the 20th century is the long retreat from that position as they began to discover, well, that's not actually true. There's parts of people.
Well, you had the romantic pushback where
Yes,
basically the bean counter became Mephistopheles.
yes. The
The
hippie
the
movement was
absolute
very romantic.
Mephistopheles was a negator
Right,
of everything that was beyond the nitty gritty.
right, right. But all these struggles that happen in modernity, which we'll talk about later, they are the sorts of arguments and struggles that didn't happen in the medieval period at all. And they didn't happen in the ancient period at all. They saw the world differently, so they didn't have those kinds of arguments. They just didn't think the way about those things the way that we do. And this is kind of where
Well,
these.
it was all right in medieval age. You could leave everything to God. God will fix it.
Yes, but they would have endless discussions about what exactly God meant by this thing or that thing, and how do we reconcile what the Holy Book tells us with what we actually see when we go out and do farming. Why do some things not match up? And there must be an explanation. Maybe God's plan is mysterious, and they're looking for ways to make sense out of the pieces that don't fit together. And we're doing that too, except that God isn't the center of our focus anymore. Now the center of our focus is our abstract categories.
Now
And
that we've thrown God under the bus. And
yes,
by bus, we mean, of course, the one that was horse drawn,
yes,
which
yes.
is if you wanted to commit suicide, that was a place to go.
Yeah, that's right. So anyway, this is kind of the stuff about this. So, but for Fei Wu Ling, who I'm about to call on in a moment, so the idea is that by Hegel's categories of European history, we know of 3 epochs. And those are the 3 we're focusing on in this book, not because Europe is the center of the world or is better than anything else, but strictly because we have a lot of documentation. The Greeks started fanatically writing everything down, and they started it early enough that we learn a great deal about the ancient epoch. We don't know how it started, We've been working on using archaeology to fill in the blanks, but we know how it ended. The medieval period is the most important period for us to study because we know how it started and how it ended. And that whole thing was documented. And of course, in the modern epoch, we have the opposite problem from the ancient. We know how it started, but we don't know how it's going to end. Although there's no end of moderns who are happy to tell you how it's going to end because we think that we know the future with a level of confidence no previous epoch ever believed. So anyway, that's what we know so far. Thanks, Stephen. So Fei Wuling, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, thank you. I want to go back to the world view question. I don't know what's the rationale of the author who wrote the book you are discussing. I haven't read it and I don't intend to. Why he thinks people from different eras have different world views. Because I beg to differ. For a few years, I was a individualistic anarchist, and I had exactly the same worldview as Yan Zhu and Zhuangzi, and also 19th century American Henry Thoreau. For example, Yan Zhu proposed the vision of a society where the regulation of one's internal states, such as desires, emotions, and actions, could obviate the need for external governance. And I held exactly the same view as him. And he lived about 2,500 years ago. And I'm sure a lot of individualistic anarchists have similar worldviews. And now I am no longer an anarchist. I'm still an anarchist, but I don't think humanity has is there yet, because we still have reptile brains, and our brain capacity is only utilized about 10%. Now I have a similar worldview with Plato, in that we both don't believe democracy, especially modern Western liberal democracy, will work in the long term. And just like a Roman Republic ended, liberal democracy will end too. And we'll probably start in the US, and then I mean, a revolution is coming. And so liberal democracy will end probably from the US, and then all Western civilization, societies as well.
Okay, so you have your question is about what the validity of the concept of a worldview. Would you like me to respond to that?
Sure, please do. Go ahead. Thank you.
It's a good question. Thank you, Fei Wuling. So the basis of this idea, it's a little tricky to explain, but let me see if I can give it let's actually take a little bit of time to talk about this. This is pretty important. So nobody disputes the existence of optical illusions, right? We know that there are optical illusions, and anyone can demonstrate them very easily. If you just Google a little bit and look at collections of optical illusions, you will notice that even though you might know in your brain that it's an optical illusion, you can often see your vision and your vision center of your brain struggling to interpret the thing that it's looking at. There's countless examples. It's really easily demonstrated. So the concept that we want to deal with here is of a cognitive illusion. This is another kind of illusion. And the thing about a cognitive illusion is that it's not based on your vision, it's based on your thinking. And so the idea is, if vision, which is a fairly straightforward process, relatively speaking, it's very tethered to reality. The things that you're trying to evaluate are right in front of you, your eyes translating it into mechanical impulses, the chemical impulses, and so forth. If that can be confused, then how much more easily would it be to be confused about the rest of your brain, where you're thinking about abstract ideas and concepts and meaning and all of those things without the advantage of vision to tether you to reality. If you cut the tether to reality, how far awry can your thinking go? And the idea of a cognitive illusion is that, well, of course, it could go a lot further. You could be much further off reality than you are with an optical illusion. Now, optical illusion might be disturbing or confusing, but it's fairly minimal how far off reality you're going. But with a cognitive illusion, you could go much further from reality because you don't have vision tethering you. So I'll give you an example. All of the modern thinking about intelligence, of the last 40 years, is that human intelligence, is an incredibly complicated topic. They talk about the way that, for example, you might have an intellectual capacity for how well do you learn math and logic and systems, but that's a different part of your intelligence from what an artist has. I'm looking at Phil here, who has the ability to look at, a spatial field, and think about how it's laid out and how does a human being interpret that space and react to it, and how can you use color and rhythm and contrast and other techniques to draw their attention here or there or what have you. And what we find is that people, in the most case, people who are very, very good at logic and math and people who are very, very good at the graphic arts, although there's some overlap, mostly there's not. And another key kind of intelligence, Martin Gardner, it's one of the Gardners who wrote a book called The Theory of Multiple Intelligences. It came out in the late 80s, and he sort of talked about some of these ideas. Another example is emotional intelligence. Do you know what you're feeling? Do you know how to read other people's feelings? Or do you find other people's emotions confusing and you wish they would just literally tell you, what they're thinking? It's a classic stereotype that many intellectuals have a very low emotional quotient. That it's the intellectual who doesn't know when he's angry or upset. I lived that life, right? I would sit at work programming, go wildly working on my software, and look up and discover that I'd forgotten to eat breakfast or lunch. I was so detached from my body's needs. I was disconnected, and I spent years in therapy learning how to get access to my feelings because my IQ was very high at a time when my EQ was very low. So my personal experience bears out Gardner's observations that emotional intelligence and intellectual intelligence are very different. Same is certainly true of artistic intelligence. There are people who have social gifts. There are people who have musical gifts. There's a wide variety of forms of intelligence. And the more we look at it, the more we realize, if you think about it, if all these different things can be at different levels, how could it make any sense that your intelligence can be summed up with an integer? An IQ of 100, an IQ of 150, an IQ of 80. What do these things even mean? Like, if I'm brilliant at math and logic, but I'm very bad at emotions, which integer sums that up? And anybody who's good at formal systems will tell you that it's impossible. You need at least two integers. And if there's like 8 or 12 different aspects to intelligence, you would need 8 or 12 different numbers to work with. And that's assuming they could even be represented numerically. But let's assume for the moment that they can. That means the concept of an IQ, which is a single number which is going to sum up your intelligence, is insane. It's insane. You can't reduce that much complexity to a single value like that without losing almost all of the important features of the intelligence, right? Because it's going to make you go out. If you want someone to compose you a brilliant symphony, you're going to go out and hire a mathematician who doesn't know jack shit about music because his math quotient is so high, it makes his number high. If you can't distinguish the different pieces, then you can't figure out when somebody's intelligence is relevant to the job at hand. That is to say, your model of intelligence has no discriminating power. It's a bad model from a scientific perspective. And yet, to this day, despite the fact it's patently obvious that IQ is a ridiculous idea, IQ is still talked about everywhere, all the time in pop culture. People are always saying, "Oh, he's got a high IQ, or he's got a low IQ." This is part of our. It's part of our language. It's part of our laws. You can find references in the legal code to whether somebody is competent to stand trial, and IQ is one of the things that they will list. Is his IQ high enough? And of course, if IQ is bullshit, what's that doing in our law code? And even where it's not in the law code, legislators and administrators of government agencies, they talk about IQ. They're all walking around with this concept of an IQ in their head. And every one of them who's doing it is basically representing the truth that they themselves are incompetent to understand human intelligence. Their model for human intelligence is completely absurd and ridiculous. There's no basis in reality. And yet, all these people with this incompetence are running the world. So what we have here is an example of a cognitive illusion. Because if you don't examine the assumptions that underlie IQ, if you don't look into the structure of intelligence and see how you know, my specialty, and Donald might work in this area too, is I work in information science and computer science. So I work in how do you represent aspects of the world in terms of discrete information you can store in a computer. It's my specialty. And lots of people are good at this. And any of them, if they looked at the theory of multiple intelligence, would conclude it's absolutely absurd that you could represent, you know, the things that we need to know about intelligence. Just even the practical things that we need to know about intelligence. You can't represent them with a single integer. It's almost a useless integer. So here's the thing. It demonstrates how easy it is for a cognitive illusion to capture tens or hundreds of millions of people so that they all fall under the illusion. They all believe it, and they all believe it together. But before the concept of IQ was invented, nobody believed. We're talking about worldviews. I'm getting here right now. This is the line. Before the invention of IQ, nobody believed that IQ was a good representation of intelligence because they didn't have the model of IQ. They used other ways of representing human intelligence. It's not that they didn't think anything about intelligence. People have been debating intelligence for thousands of years, but they used other alternative models. They thought about it in fundamentally different ways than those of us did who grew up in the IQ era. And so you can draw a line in history, and in the case of IQ, it's a very crisp line, between the worldviews of people who subscribe to the concept of IQ, which is a cognitive illusion, in the modern world, versus the earlier people who could not possibly have subscribed to the model of IQ because it hadn't been developed yet. That is, you can segment history into two groups, everybody before a certain date and then a growing number of people after a certain date as the concept of IQ was popularized. And now that the theory of multiple intelligence has arisen in psychology and is beginning to displace the model of IQ, step by step, the number of people who believe in the IQ model is going back down. And the number of people who believe in the theory of multiple intelligences and are looking for some other way to represent human intelligence is going up. So there's going to come a time when the model of IQ is in the past, and nobody believes that anymore, except, you know, a few flat earthers. There's always, as we said, there's always some people who hang on to an old idea, but they'll be vanishingly small percentage of the population. And then you'll be able to say, here are two lines in history. The line at which the concept of IQ arose and the line at which the concept of IQ faded away. And that will have divided history into three distinct groups in which the differences between them are measurable and have a measurable impact, not just on their idle thinking by themselves, but how they write laws and how they organize government agencies and corporations and how they actually take actions that affect the world. They're being transformed by these fundamental models of the world that they have. So this is to demonstrate the differences in perspective and models and that they're real. So, but here's the critical thing. This is the critical thing about worldviews. When you subscribe to a worldview, part of what defines it as a worldview is that it's not an opinion. It's something that almost everybody around you shares at the same time. That's what makes it a worldview. Anything less than that, and it's not a worldview. But if almost everybody shares it, it has become a worldview. So what's interesting about that is that even if this idea given to you by your worldview is completely wrong, everywhere you turn, everybody's telling you it's right because they all believe it too. You're getting massive social reward for sticking with that idea, even in the absence of evidence. In fact, even in the presence of evidence that seems to suggest that it's wrong, you still have all these people telling you it's right. You're getting social rewards for treating it as though it's right. That encourages us to believe that it's right. So there's a power to a worldview. It has a power to shape people into staying within the boundaries of the worldview and not straying too far. And there's certain ways in which if you try to stray from the worldview, you get into serious trouble. People don't just look at you like you're weird. They won't hire you for a job. If the job, for example, is to administer to low IQ people certain kinds of services, and you need that job to pay your rent, but you don't believe that IQ is real, you've got a fundamental problem. You may end up homeless unless you decide that IQ is a perfectly fine idea and you're willing to subscribe to it, and now you can pay your rent and you're not homeless. There are huge economic incentives that push people in this direction. So the question is, if people are so objective, like the modern world says, if we have the ability to see reality the way it actually is, then how come it's so easy for people to convince themselves that things that are actually false must be true because of the rewards involved? We see people doing it around us all the time. There is a power of interpretation. And the power of interpretation is as follows. I'm going to use phrenology now as my second example. It's closely related to the IQ example. People used to believe that you could measure the shape of the head. And what you discover is some people, if you look down from the top, some people have a long oval head and some people have a very round head from the top. And in the 19th century and early 20th century, people were obsessed with this difference. And they believed that one of them represented a high intelligence and one of them represented a low intelligence. This is prior to the development of IQ tests. And they went around measuring, they got calipers, they went around measuring everybody's heads so they could decide which bucket to put them in. Are you a dummy or are you a smarty? Right? And the thing about it is that whichever the group was that they thought were the dummies, there were plenty of people who were obviously smarties. And the group that they thought was the smarties contained plenty of people who were actually dummies. There's lots of people who didn't fit this model. It was even worse than the IQ model. It's a, you know, modern anatomy and intelligence theory, neither of them agrees with this idea of phrenology. They find it absurd. It's like flat earth ideas at this point. But the people who believed in it were very, I mean, there were whole lines of theory, there were whole industries that built up around this, and they did something that tells us about the power of a worldview. And what they did was this. Every time they found an individual who conformed with their model, they paid a lot of attention. They wrote them up in newspapers. They wrote them up in articles in scientific journals. They thought about them. They remembered them. They wrote them in their notes. And every time they found somebody who didn't fit the model, they did one of two things. They either ignored the evidence that they didn't fit the model and said, maybe you're smarter than you appear to be. You must have some hidden depths of intelligence secretly. And I know it didn't show up in the test, but I bet you're smarter than my test says. And conversely, when they found the ones that were supposed to be dummies who tested high, they'd say, maybe you're some kind of weird savant, an anomaly. Or maybe, you know, it's an accident. You actually made some errors and your test score is higher than it actually should be represented. That is, they found ways to reinterpret the evidence in direct opposition to what the evidence was telling them. And they didn't have any trouble doing this. It was perfectly easy. Smart people have an easy time massaging the evidence of the world to fit their worldview. They do it all the time. But the most powerful way that they did this is they just forgot about the people who didn't fit their model. They'd say, well, that's not interesting. I'm looking, I want to build a curve that demonstrates that the round heads and the oval heads fit my idea of who's smart and who's dumb. So what I'm going to do is every time I find somebody who doesn't fit it, I'll just exclude them from my study and forget about them. And then the next day, you know, I've kind of half forgotten that they exist. And I look at my graph, I measure somebody new, they do fit my model, and I add them to my graph. So there's this cherry picking that happens with the ability to pay attention and to collect evidence that allows people to prove on paper and in their own minds that their bad model actually fits reality. This capacity is something called nescience. Now I'm gonna put the word actually in the nescience. Nescience is the capacity of the human mind to suppress information it doesn't want to deal with. Nescience. And nescience is one of the most powerful faculties of the mind. And the way that you know it's one of the most powerful faculties of the mind, and we've talked about this before on these calls, is that studies about how well people process lists of things show that if the list is too long, people struggle to find their way through it. But if the list is short enough, people can easily remember and select the item that they want to pick off the list. And the number comes out to about 7 plus or minus 2. If you get much beyond that, people start having to struggle to there's a noticeable slowdown in their reaction time as the list gets longer than that. And what it seems to demonstrate, and there have been many studies along these lines, is that the human short-term memory can only keep track of 7 plus or minus 2 things at a time. When you're sitting in your room, right now you're really paying a lot of attention to the screen and the other people in the room. But if you look away from the screen for a moment and look around your room, you're going to see all kinds of things that you remember were there, but you weren't actually thinking about them until I told you to look around the room. They had disappeared out of your short-term memory. They were in your medium-term and long-term memory. And when you look up, you can convince yourself that you never forgot it was there. Oh no, I knew that that light was there. But actually it wasn't your short-term memory that knew it was there. It was your long-term memory that knew it was there. And what you did was you swapped. You stopped looking at some of the faces on this call and you put the light fixture in your memory and it displaced somebody. So if you look around this room, count the number of things that were not in your mind while you were, I see that you're lost, but I'm coming to the point. The point is this power of nescience. Everything is about, the worldviews are defined more by the things that they fail to see than they are by the things that they do see in reality. When you look around the world, some things jump out at you as important, and other things fade away into non-importance. There's a selection that happens, a foreground-background thing that happens. And it has to happen because your short-term memory can only keep track of 7 plus or minus 2 things at a time. If you couldn't suppress the rest of the information to focus, you couldn't function consciously. You need that ability to focus. But that ability to focus, the flip side of the ability to focus is the ability to unfocus and to make everything else turn into a blurry background. I'm looking at Geneva's image on the camera and she's sharp. Everything about her is crisp and in focus, but the things behind her have blurred out, right? They're not there. At the moment, I can't see what those things are. And that's how the human mind functions as we look at the world, or as we look at each other, or as we contemplate God and nature and humanity, or if we think about what, did medieval people think, or what did Plato mean when he wrote the Republic, or what did Lao Tzu mean when he wrote the Tao Te Ching? When we do that, there's an enormous amount of selection that's happening, so that some of what those people are saying fades away into the background. We skim over that part, doesn't seem interesting to us. And other things jump out at us and we cherry pick those as the important parts. So the key to a worldview is 2 people from 2 different worldviews can read exactly the same text, but different things will jump out at them. Different things will fade into the background and different things will come to the foreground. One of the ways that you can see this, I'm going to contrast the modern and the medieval, which Stephen brought up earlier, is God. If I'm trying to explain why an airplane crashed, if I'm a crash investigator and I'm working for the FAA, if I write in my report, it crashed because God wanted it to crash. God works in mysterious ways. He must have had a plan. It must have been time for those people to die. He wanted to bring them back to heaven. I'll get fired. And I'll get fired because that is not an acceptable answer from the modern worldview. I would be considered incompetent at my job. But conversely, if in the medieval epoch they had an FAA, and I wrote a report that said it was caused by air turbulence, it was caused by wear on a certain screw that holds the wing onto the body of the plane, and that's why it broke loose. If I say, the inspection procedures weren't kept up, blah, blah, blah. If I didn't say, well, I'm glad you wouldn't fire me, but if I were not to include in my report that God wanted it that way, the medieval agency would fire me, if not burn me at the stake. Because I would be denying the power of God to control all things in the cosmos, which was central to the medieval worldview. Medievals believed nobody should be king unless God picked them. You couldn't hold secular power without God's approval. But in the modern world, when people say, yeah, I know nobody voted for me, but God has chosen me, so I should be president, that doesn't tend to work out very well. We have fundamentally different value systems from the medieval epoch. They're alien to each other. In fact, they're incompatible with each other. And that incompatibility, well, you might personally hold the same worldview as the medievals, but if you were to run for president right now and nobody voted for you, but you thought that God had chosen you, you probably wouldn't be surprised that you didn't get elected, because after all, you didn't get any votes. Even a modern religious person understands that the system is what decides who becomes president, not God's approval of you. If all you have is God's approval, but you don't get the votes, you're not going to get elected. Everybody knows that. All moderns know that. But medievals didn't know that. They didn't believe that at all. Which is why Joan of Arc, a little peasant girl from the backwoods of France, could say, I think God is speaking to me, and God wants me to throw out the interlopers, the English interlopers from France. And with no literacy and no background in military and no political power whatsoever, she could rise up and create an entire movement of people who believed that God really was speaking to her. And they really did push back the English and win all kinds of battles that the highly trained French military couldn't win, because medievals had a fundamentally different worldview from us. It was enough to have God's approval in the medieval epoch. They saw the world differently than the way we see it. In the ancient world, it was different. It had to do with personal character. What is your nature? Right? God was secondary to that. And votes were secondary to that. These are three incompatible worldviews. And they offer not just slightly different, but effectively opposing answers to the same deep questions about the meaning of life. And that's the level at which they operate. But what makes a worldview powerful, and this is the point of the book, to answer your question, this is the point of the book. What makes a worldview powerful is that you can be a modern and read a medieval or an ancient work and think that you understand it. You can read it and it all makes sense to you because your power of nescience pushes into the background all the things that don't make sense and cherry picks for you the parts that do make sense until it seems to you you have a grasp of that work. But the meaning you take away from that work is alien to and opposed to the meaning that the original author put into that work. And the only way to see that is if you develop the ability to hold more than one worldview at a time, to be able to shift between them. If you could learn to see the use of language and meaning the way that Heraclitus does, then when you read Heraclitus's fragments, you will arrive at completely different conclusions about what he means than if you just read them like a modern does. And I know that because I have piles of books on Heraclitus written by moderns who think they understand him perfectly well. And and Kenneth Smith does this too. I can just check through the mistakes that they're making one by one and say, they thought this because of the modern worldview. They thought that because of the modern worldview. In some cases, I see medievals or neo-medievals writing about Heraclitus, and they're trying to reinterpret him from a medieval framework. And there too, once you know the medieval framework, you can see where they have deviated from Heraclitus's meaning and found a way to substitute a medieval meaning that satisfies them more. So these are what worldviews are. They're massive shared interpretive frameworks that are shared by most of the world, or at least whole continents at a time. But that we're not talking about individual opinions. We're talking about vast stretches of time and space and interpretation. And that's what he's writing about in this book. If that doesn't speak to you, that's fine. We're not saying this is true. We're saying this is a philosophical book. We're here to study this philosophical book and learn, what is it that he's trying to say. We're each going to go home and make up our own minds about these things. This isn't about indoctrination or brainwashing. This is about trying to understand what a particular philosopher is saying to us. And the way that he says it to us, as you're going to see in these calls, is he says it by pointing to what other philosophers have said and written. So it's, again, he's not promulgating his own idea. He's trying to describe for us. He's trying to describe for us three different worldviews that have included billions of people among one or another of them, so that we can try to understand the differences. I hope that helps. If not, that's probably the best I can do. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I was going to say something else, but since you brought up this question, it's a very important question. both involves the suppression of Geist by zeitgeist, and embedded in that is really the long history of Western intellectual history as embedded in the ascendance of mathematics as almost ontology unto itself. And in that sense, and I think that's what happened to kind of logical positivism, was an attempt to find a vehicle that would, in a sense, mediate nescience in this sense, because we understand that we are trapped in this thing by our limited minds, that we have this relationship between foreground and backgrounding. And David Hilbert, who tried very hard, was I'm not a mathematician, so I'm not speaking as an absolute, expert, but he tried this and he really found out that mathematics couldn't do that. However, it does seem that mathematics does have a place in the world. I mean, starting with Plato in a way, and I guess Pythagoras and Plato and on, but it does have a place in the sense that as long as we realize it's not an ontology, but a tool. Mathematics is a good tool. And if we realize it as a tool, like a hammer is a tool, a hammer is not an ontology, or metaphysics is a tool. It does help us in a limited way. And we then realize that mathematics could develop in different ways, like multi-factor logic, all kind of new mathematics as new tools, as we know what a hammer, it could be a jackhammer, all sorts of things. A screwdriver could be all sorts of intricate developments in terms of the understanding. So there's a profound relationship in the world of tools between between, I guess, the way we build a world and the systems that the tool or the technology actually provides a kind of measure to construct a world in a way. So in a sense, like multi-factor logic, in fact, like I said, chaos theory could somehow be embedded in probabilities rather than absolute answers. And we know these things, and these are kind of important tools that are much more refined than just sort of like simple geometry or a number theory. So I think there's a place for it, as long as we recognize that it is not an ontology, which they hoped it was, which by the way, Euclid, I mentioned this before. Euclid, the fifth postulate was a very important part that in a sense allowed mathematics to be treated in a much more creative way. There's not that, that there's not, the world may not obey just a plane of geometry, but in fact it could exist in a curved structure. So, and for many years, of course, obviously that was a stupid postulate because what's the use, right? But it turns out it's a factor that the mind could create. And in some sense, I actually think, this goes back to my original thing that I want to talk about, that the rise and fall of civilization to a certain degree, at least, is embedded in the ability to control the use of in a sense, this sort of technology, right? We misuse it, for instance, like inventing the atomic bomb, then we would destroy ourselves. But if we use it in the right way, I was thinking when you were mentioning about the rise and fall of civilization, part of the fall of the church might have been ideology. Yeah, I admit that's true. But that ideology was able to be truncated to a certain degree by the invention of the printing press. I mean, like Martin Luther didn't post a thing on the church, and that was a singular thing, but it was printed. Everybody had a copy of it. So you can't stop the information. If there wasn't the technology and there was a bunch of scribes writing it, it wouldn't have the same kind of revolution. And that revolution completely changed society in the sense. And then I thought back, what made for the fall of the Roman Empire? Certainly, it was the relationship between the center of Rome and the hinterlands, which they control. But part of it is that you have to pay for the army. And when you're running out of money, what you did was you contaminated the gold coins and the silver coins with other metals, and people pretty soon discover, hey, this is not worth what was promised. It was. And so they decided not to fight for the Roman army. But if they had the real goal, yeah, I'll be glad to fight for you, risk my life, and they would have sustained themselves. So the technology was a failed technology because they contaminated the damn gold. And we know we're doing the same thing now with a fiat currency. It contaminate the worth of money. I mean, currency and money are different things. And so therefore, everybody knows, the dollars they own in debt that the United States had in debt for, it's going to be fade away because of inflation, and therefore they're going to be worthless, worth less and less. I should say worthless, worth less and less. And so therefore, people are trying to get out of the dollar dominancy. So in the same sense, we have technology that created now the internet, and information is being controlled or miscontrolled. We can't handle. We can't constrain it, in a sense, and that's going to deteriorate our governance in a sense. And we see that's happening. Now we can't even tell. Well, not all of us, but most people can't even tell what's the truth and what's a lie. And so all mixed. They can't. How could they make a decision when they can't even tell what information is being over? So the control of the information system becomes a very important factor in terms of what the governance is able to do, and there's a real danger that Donald Trump might win again because nobody knows what the hell the truth is, and so therefore, in some sense, once again, that has to do the failure, the success of technology in terms of controlling a population, because if you don't know what the hell is going on, how are you going to make a decision? Because we only have limited capacity to understand things. So the technology is a very important part. I mean, I think it could be the technology could lead you to a downfall. It could lead you to liberation. It's just a very, very important thing in terms of human being using it as a tool, because it's not an ontology. It is a tool that controls our understanding, and we know that's true. So, you could convince me, your friends and your neighbors maybe about what the truth is, but you can't control everybody in every state. We'll all feel helpless. So technology is a kind of an ambiguous thing because the tool could be used in the right way, or it could be used in the wrong way. And so we have to have a real deep thinking and a deep implementation of what tools are properly used for and not misproperly used. And we're not thinking deep enough about how to do it because, we're always being told like, oh, don't let the money constrain our technology because that's our progress to the future and win against Russia and China. But on the same hand, it's also destroying ourselves in some sense. So it's a difficult thing, to do. Okay, I see Sharon wanted us to get back to the text.
Yes. Thank you, Phil. I'll call on Stephen and Jenny, and then I'm going to take us to the text like Sharon suggests. So Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I spent quite a bit of time with world views about 30 years ago. And so it's something that was particularly pronounced in the German idealistic movement. And unfortunately, I keep on pointing to, because none of us can speak German almost, and we don't know the full extent of the German idealistic material. We're only seeing the surface portion of the iceberg. And they did spend a lot of time determining what worldviews were. So, you know, the Germans did do some good stuff, but there are a certain set of fundamental worldviews. Now, Rick, you said a worldview is what everybody agrees on. Well, before that, there's a reason why they agree that it's a worldview. It's because it tends to be a common experience. So let's not forget that there are actual observations going on, Rick. We're not simply agreeing that there are dragons. Now, a certain basic observation we have in our life is the controversy between spirit and matter. Okay, we see this stuff out there, it's called matter. And then we notice our mind seems to be invisible. And we're inclined to call it as spirit. So we look at this controversy, two worldviews. A worldview is something that says, makes a clear statement about the world. Materialism says the world is made of matter. The person who believes in spirit, which is the opposite. We have two opposite worldviews. Not to forget this opposition between spirit and matter is fundamental. So we have a worldview which says there is such a thing as spirit. Of course, Marx comes along and says, no, spirit is all twaddle. It's just matter. But we still see the operation of this controversy. Now, if we look at the Egyptian culture, it was heavily involved in this controversy. Here I am living in the world of matter. Oh, well, I know it's going to end one day. Where do I go after that? So the Egyptian culture invested a huge amount into their idea of the spirit. A fascinating thing is when we see the axial age, which wasn't exclusively the Greeks, but the Greeks were the outstanding examples, that the controversy changes. The controversy between spirit and matter is almost native to any people, but we start to see the new controversy arise, which suddenly skepticism appears and people are starting to think, well, what is an idea and what is reality? I have an idea about things, but I discover that these ideas might not be true. This sort of skepticism didn't exist so much with the Egyptians. You look at the early Egyptians, it was plain what was good in life. It was plain what was bad in life. But of course, the skeptic starts to wonder, oh, well, am I really having a good time, even though I'm living in a palace somewhere and, got all these slaves serving me, and am I not a beggar of the spirit? We see this new age where we have these worldviews clashing, idealism and realism, a whole new load of stuff spews out. And of course, this wasn't just in Greece. You have Confucius. You have the Tao belief, Oh, well, the Tao goes away from simple monism. The Tao goes, well, all reality must be a balance between opposite forces, which can cooperate or conflict. Or we have Buddha. Buddha's asking that question. Here I am, a prince in India, got a nice palace, got a nice princess. I'm still not happy. You know, somehow it's all inadequate. Here we have this spirit of skepticism, which shows up in the axial age. Other aspects of worldviews. All right, the worldview says there is spirit. There are spirits. There's a spirit in that tree. There's a god of the fountain. There's this god here. We have this pre-axial age spirituality, which saw individual spiritual potentials in everything. But then a new type of spirituality arises, the idea of one God. But some philosophers would say that the monotheists are actually just pneumatists. They've grouped all the gods together in one category. They've put them all into one basket and called it one God, and said that the divine breath of this God pervades all reality. So we have, instead of just spiritualism or spiritism, we have another divine doctrine, which is called pneumatism. Pneumatism is the idea, the belief that a worldview which says the whole universe is pervaded by the force or a divine breath. And yeah, well, this is unfortunate, but in current philosophy, they don't really outline the worldviews that well anymore. You tend to find it if you delve into stuff. But unfortunately, they just don't lay it out for students very well. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, that was a helpful review. Ginny, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Just a very quick comment. Going a couple of conversations back, Rick, I thought all these years I wasn't absolutely sure whether Saint Joan was real or a mythological figure, but you're saying she was flesh and bones real person?
She was absolutely real.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
It's a good question, because there's a lot of early saints that we're pretty sure weren't real. You know, that in the early stages of Christianity reaching out across Europe and trying to convert the pagans, they often found that the pagans absolutely wouldn't convert unless they could bring their favorite gods or goddesses along. And so some of the early Christian missionaries would say, okay, well, your goddess Bridget, let's just call her a saint. So now you've got Saint Bridget. And then the Irish are like, well, if I can have Saint Bridget, then I'm willing to be a Christian. And this happened all over the world. I mean, all over the world, there are kind of early missionary stage saints who weren't real people. They were local divinities who were converted from a god into a saint. So I can see why you asked the question, but Joan, she's a historical figure. She was during the 100 Years' War in France, and she's very well attested and documented for a lot of reasons, not least of which is she's in court trial documents from when she was put on trial and burned at the stake.
Yeah, I did a monologue to audition for a couple of years when I first arrived in New York, because I thought, oh, I want to play heroines, you know, whenever I could. And it was based on George Bernard Shaw's play. But I didn't really thoroughly study the actual historical fact about her. But so I feel like she is close to my heart because, you know, of her monologues I used for a couple of years.
Yeah, when we get into the chapters about the medieval worldview, we're definitely going to spend some time on Joan, because she's a classic example of something that doesn't happen anymore. In the modern worldview, that doesn't occur. In the modern age, but in the medieval age, that occurred more than once. She's a notable example, but there were many examples throughout the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages that preceded them of people inspired by God at a level of fervor and effectiveness that we don't see in the modern world. I mean, in the modern world, you can have people who are religious and who are personally inspired. Martin Luther King Jr. is another one of my classic examples from the modern world. He was inspired, clearly, but he didn't come from nowhere. He was part of an existing civil rights movement, and he was part of an existing church structure. And those institutions supported him and allowed him to be more effective. They helped make sure he had some place to stay in the cities where he traveled. You know, if he didn't have that, he might not have even been able to travel at all. They would arrange, you know, the speaking venues. They would send out the invites and bring people. They would help organize the marches. You know, the modern picture of Martin Luther King Jr. has a tendency to present him as an anomaly. He's just this one guy who was amazing, but he was part of a large movement of people, and it was the larger structure that made him effective. Any number of people who feel inspired by God stand around on street corners downtown in Seattle and tell you about the end times and everything else, and no large movement rises up to follow them, which is, again, a very different behavior from what we see in the medieval period. There is a, you know, in the modern period, to be effective, even if you're inspired by God, you also have to have the support, the infrastructure, the systemic support, because that's what defines the modern epoch, and that's what people will respond to. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Very quickly, I like what Stephen just said, because worldview is that he gave several examples of what worldviews are, and I think the way I understand it is expressed in ethics, religion, philosophy, scientific beliefs, depending on the period. And I think, I know we're having this big discussion about worldview, but it's something that changes, and it's based on a collection of attitudes and values and stories on the people existing within a certain time. And it has a very, very strong social, political, economic underpinning, right? And that's what makes it magical. That's what makes it interesting. And I think we just have to take the beliefs from each particular time period and see how it has impacted us in our existence, our current existence. That's all I have to say. Yeah, it doesn't sound complex to me.
Thank you, Sharon. So I'm going to take us back to the text. And in order to ramp us up into this, I mean, I guess I want to talk about a couple of things. And one is the idea that knowing what we think and what we prefer and what's interesting to us is fine. That's all well and good. But as long as that's the only thing we focus on, what do we like? What do we find interesting? What do we believe? The ancient Greeks would say we're idiots. And they're not insulting us by calling us idiots. They're saying the word idiot itself comes from the Greek. And it's in, I put these sentences back in here again. And the one I want to call our attention to is, it's right there. He's talking about Aristotle. Let me read the sentences and then I'm going to unpack them. What is ultimately idiotist in human beings demands the same right of autonomy that Aristoi wield, the right to pursue freely what seems important to oneself. But in the case of the mass of idiotes, that freedom would prove catastrophic to human order or nomos. Neither law nor quality would be possible in the economy, and democracy would devolve into a political Babel. Now, let's start with that word idiotes. This isn't like poo-poo head. This isn't an insult, right? So here's idiotes, and I'm going to take us into Wiktionary. This is the most important thing to get out of these sentences as we prepare for paragraph 12. So let's start with Wiktionary, and we're going to look at the English word idiot, right? And if you look at that article, you'll see that it traces back to the ancient Greek idiotes, which is the word that he's transcribed there. And I'm going to copy that and paste it in here. Ooh, no, I didn't get the whole thing. Let me try it again. Yeah, here we go. Idiotes, right? That's the Greek, idiotes. And it comes from idios. And I'm going to give us idios. There's a reason I'm doing this. You'll see what it is in a moment. So the Wiktionary article on idios is here. And the thing about idios is that its origins are such that what it means, it actually breaks down into two parts, idios, which means one's own. One's own. Idios equals one's own. So The Greeks said, of course, we all have the things that we prefer. Maybe I like to talk about politics. And if we talk about other things, I get bored. And I want to change. If you start talking about those other things, I want to change the subject. I want to get us back to the part I like, politics. But maybe Phil wants to talk about art. And he doesn't want to talk about politics. Maybe politics is one of the things that bores him. And so if I succeed in dragging the discussion over to politics, then Phil's going to get bored and he's going to try to drag the discussion off of politics and back to art. Not the real Phil. I'm talking about a hypothetical Phil, who's more. Phil is broader than this, but let's imagine that Phil is that narrow. You can see the problem immediately, right? There are 11 of us on this call. And if each of us is only willing to talk about the things that we personally are interested in, then it's not possible to have a larger discussion unless we all happen to be, fans of the exact same thing. We could have a Star Trek convention full of Star Trek people and they could all talk Star Trek and they could all be happy. But if we're trying to talk about a general topic like worldviews, you're going to find that there aren't a whole bunch of worldview fans who are all obsessed with talking about worldviews, and that you could put together a worldview convention to get them together and they could be happy. Instead, it's going to be people from varied backgrounds with varied interests who have to find some way to be willing to talk about things other than their own most central interests. And the ancient Greeks were very concerned about this problem. They're very concerned about this problem. Moderns aren't. We think if you throw 8 lions and a zebra into a room and have them vote on what to have for lunch, surely only goodness will follow, right? Because we believe that voting magically solves problems. But it doesn't really solve a problem for the zebra. It creates the problem for the zebra, which is that we've now given permission for the lions to eat it. The ancient Greeks recognized that problem with democracy. There's a good democracy and there's a bad democracy. And the bad democracy is where a bunch of people who don't have anything in common and don't have the ability to care about things outside their own pet interests, they all try to have a vote on what to do. Aristotle said that's a disaster. When that happens, it's a disaster. It ends up being mobocracy. It's rule of the majority, tyranny of the majority, and oppression of the minority. It says that is among the worst governments human beings could possibly have. Now, that's the government the United States has. Exactly the one he said was one of the worst. He said the good democracy is the one where you have people who have the capacity to care about something other than their own family, their own neighborhood, their own favorite foods, their own topics of interest. They have the capacity to step out of their own worldview and look at the larger picture and say, what all is really needed here? And to negotiate the differences between people, they don't just vote. They also have shared principles. Why are we all here? What are we all trying to achieve that we agree on? And if we have the combination of those two things, then having a bunch of us vote is among the best of all possible governments. You see the difference? So this issue of can people step outside of an obsession with their own things? Can they care about things other than their own family, their own wife, their own house, their own favorite plants? If you can't have that, then what you have is a disaster. It's impossible to make a decent government if all you've got are people like that. So one's own, idios, this is the central issue. People who can't escape from their own perspective and preferences are a fundamental different kind of cognitive species or characterological species from people who can and do routinely set aside their own obsessions to think about the larger picture. One of the tests for this is, can you be character, right? This is what Sharon's saying. This is the central issue. To the Greeks, the central issue is character. And another word for character is nature. What is your nature as a person? What is your character? By nature, how do you make decisions? How do you choose what to focus on? How do you negotiate differences? And they say the world falls into 3 camps, and 2 of the camps share in common that they cannot separate themselves from their own things. The 3rd camp struggles to separate themselves from their own things, but at least they struggle. And it means that from time to time, They can temporarily set aside their obsessions to focus on the larger picture. So idiocy, to be an idiot from the ancient Greek perspective, has these two different meanings. One meaning is it refers to the two categories of people who never, not only don't they do it, they don't even want to separate themselves from their preferences. They think it's good to be strong in your beliefs and to go try to convert as many people as you can to believe what they believe. That's their character. It's their nature to be that way. And those people politically are a disaster. The third category are also idiots, because it's human nature. This is the other definition of idiot. It's human nature to be an idiot. It is natural to be obsessed with your own point of view because you're immortal and you're finite. And you only have the one body. And as you move around, that's your point of view. I cannot possibly care about what's happening on Mars right now as much as I care what's happening on this call. It's just not possible. My brain's here, my eyes are here, my ears are here. You guys are here. Everything I'm focused on is here. To be mortal, the difference between a mortal and an immortal or a sacred, something that's sacred or a god, is that something that's immortal or sacred or a god is not restricted by this suffocating envelope. What the ancient Greeks would have said was incestuous. How closed in and enveloped the mortal perspective is. We're stuck in one tiny point. And from that, we try to generalize about the whole world. So there's a level at which to be an idiot to the Greeks is inherent to human nature. It is the nature of Homo sapiens that we're idiots. But within that broad, and anybody who can't accept that is doubly an idiot, because the difference between being that way and not being that way is the difference between being a mortal and a god. So someone who says, I'm not an idiot, I'm not limited by my perspective, is basically saying they have a divine perspective. In other words, they're saying they're a god. This is what the ancients think. And what do you say to someone who says, I'm God and you should all do what I say because I see things the way they really are and I don't make any mistakes? What you say is, I have a nice padded room for you, buddy. You're going to hurt yourself and the people around you if you don't recognize your fallibility as a mortal, right? You're a menace. So the first step on the road to wisdom, as Socrates says, is to acknowledge our fallibility and our limitations. If the oracle at Delphi says that I am the wisest of all the Greeks, says Socrates, the only possible reasonable interpretation of that must be because among the Greeks, I'm the one who's the clearest about the fact that I know nothing. For sure. I'm immortal. I know I'm not a god, says Socrates. And yet I look around myself and I see levels of confidence in my compatriots that make me suspicious that at least part of the time they think they are gods. They take for granted a level of overconfidence in their own opinions that would only be justified if they were gods, which they're not. So they're all a little crazy. So maybe that's what the oracle at Delphi means, says Socrates. So this is the ground level definition of idiot. To be mortal is to be a fool. And the nature of the fool is not just you're not wise, but that you are too focused on your own perspectives and preferences. And that it literally, linguistically means idios, one's own. You're too focused on your own things. But the second level definition of idiot is not as broad as that. And the second level definition is, of the three character classes in Homo sapiens, two of them are congenitally idiotic, because not only do they suffer from the basal state of idiocy, they like it. They think it's a virtue. They call it confidence and certainty. They call it, getting out there in the world and making a change, and all the things that are supposed to be good. That they're being leaders. They're being persuasive. You make all this list of virtues, and what they come down to is they like being idiots. They think being an idiot is good. So they're doubly trapped. So not only are they trapped, they don't even think that they're trapped. They don't think it's a trap. They think it's a virtue. They've confused the fundamental vice of Homo sapiens with a virtue. And so the chances that they're going to get out of those traps are pretty low. Maybe they will, but not until they lose their confidence, their overconfidence in themselves. The third class is the class of character that is suspicious of its own overconfidence, is suspicious of its own idiocy. And it struggles and struggles and struggles for its entire life, pushing a boulder uphill for all eternity to try, at least sometimes, to tame the overwhelming hubris of its own character. I am the main problem in my life so long as I don't question my idiocy. I need to focus on overcoming that problem, because that's the problem I'm going to carry with me everywhere I go, into every situation. It's like they say, if everywhere you go you meet assholes, the problem is probably you, because you're what all those encounters have in common. And the same is true of idiocy. I'm an idiot. Everywhere I go, I carry my idiocy with me and apply it to a diverse number of situations, right? Sometimes to math problems, sometimes to whether I'm properly moderating a philosophical Zoom meeting. I mean, my choice of what I'm going to eat today, I've got idiocy to spare for everything. It's because it's in my nature, it's in my character. But if I were raised in the ancient Greek world, if I'd been raised from birth to strive against those things, if I'd been surrounded by Aristoi who were also striving to overcome those things, and those people were helping me to learn how to do it, maybe I could have developed into that in-between state between idiocy and wisdom that the Greeks called an Aristos, which is somebody who's doing the work to try to be less idiotic less often. Those are the people that the Greeks wanted to vote. So at least sometimes they're trying to overcome the problem, unlike the other two groups who are never trying to overcome the problem, who think it's not a problem at all. So this is what he means when this is, for Fei Wu Ling's benefit, what we're doing with these sentences is we're unpacking what Kenneth Smith means. And what Kenneth Smith means is not easily said in the English language. Much easier to say in ancient Greek. They've got words for all these things. We don't. You use the word idiot in English and someone thinks you're calling them names. That's like if I pointed to somebody who's a redhead and said, you're a redhead, and they got angry and slapped me. They think the word redhead is an insult. That's how the Greeks would feel about us getting upset if someone calls us an idiot. What do you mean you're upset? It is human nature to be an idiot. That's like saying you're human and the guy gets angry and slaps you. It's like, this is core to your character. It's who you are. Do you not know yourself well enough to know that you're an idiot? Do you actually think that you can be a member of Homo sapiens and still have an objective, godlike view of what's true and what's not? The Greeks know that there's a serious problem with our species, and that problem plagues us with everything we try to do. And in this belief, this exemplifies the way in which the ancient worldview is alien to the modern worldview. Because at every turn in the modern world, we believe the opposite. We believe in the reasonable man theory. We use it in jury selection. We believe in enlightened self-interest. We use it in our theories of capitalism. All throughout our political and economic systems, there is the assumption that a normal person is pretty reasonable, pretty rational, mostly sees how things actually are, mostly knows where their interests lie. And that we get that way for free. We're just born that way as moderns. We just know. A little education and the problem solved. Whereas the Greeks believe this is the hardest of all problems to overcome. And that you don't get it for free. You aren't born that way. And that the law should not assume that everybody knows what's good for them. And if it does, it would lead to catastrophe. You'd end up with, well, look around you. This is what you end up with if you assume that everybody knows what's best for themselves. So in this, neither I nor Kev is saying this is how it is, but we're saying if you want to understand the ancient worldview and you want to understand the modern worldview, this issue of idiocy and our radically opposite attitudes towards it is one of the easiest ways to see we're dealing with two incompatible worldviews here. Call me an idiot, and what I'm going to say is, of course I am, and so are you. We're all idiots together. Hopefully, we're all struggling to overcome it as best we can, but this is the hand we're dealt. This is what evolution gave us to work with. But you call most moderns an idiot, and they want to slap you. Them's fighting words. How dare you say I don't have godlike powers of mental apprehension? Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'll begin with a very funny movie I saw that reminds me of this. It's about Napoleon, but Napoleon eventually turned out to be a good guy. But the movie was very funny in the sense it was like, so Napoleon is trapped in this city. It's a French city. It might be Paris, but I forgot the details. And he's behind the line. And he wants to command the troops and all that. He tried to convince people that he's Napoleon. Damn, I'm Napoleon, and nobody believes him because Napoleon's out there fighting the war. You know, I mean, like, why are you here? You know, so nobody believes. He tried really, really hard. It's a lot of little details, and finally, it just nobody believes him. You know, they think he's an idiot. If you want to call it that way. And finally, one of his friends who actually believes and know that he is Napoleon, finally said, you're going to have to give up the ship, man. It's like, it's not going to work. So he finally took Napoleon to a mental hospital, and he saw all sorts of people with their hands in the sleeves, and there was all these Napoleon says, if you keep doing this, you're going to end up here because there's a lot of your brothers right here. and he finally decided to change his mind and just decided to live as an ordinary human being because it wasn't going to work. It was a very funny movie how even Napoleon finally saw the wisdom of just like being part of the crowd because nobody is going to believe him. So that's very funny.
That's a great example.
So in some senses, I was thinking about this issue and this and what you just mentioned is like, how do you make the balance? Because it seems to me there's two different things you have to take account of. One is through education of some sort. In other words, get people to reach some kind of consensus. And I don't know whether there's average or median or whatever the term might be, to get them to at least agree on enough stuff through education that these are basic structures. Okay, that's one thing. But I don't think you could do that ad infinitum. So you have to have a society that you have enough looseness in the laws themselves that allows for a degree of difference in variety, so that so that things that doesn't matter that much, actually, they could indulge in, and say, oh, yeah, this is the part I really like. So I think there has to be a two-pronged approach, a centralized approach and a kind of distributed approach. Otherwise, it becomes too authoritarian, like everything has got to be this way, and there's no wiggle room whatsoever, If you infract the law just even a little bit, that's it. It's a life sentence for you. That doesn't work either. So I think knitting that together and finding out what is essential to be something that everybody should obey. And once you break that, then in a sense you are, you violated the national structure. Let's put it that way, the societal structure. But there's enough difference in the sense that everybody can still remain an individual to a degree. And I think the problem is to find that balance, we don't know what it is. You kind of find it somewhat in the market, although I don't believe in that, because there's enough variety in the market that you could choose, your thing. But the thing is that it turns out those things are in some way too similar, so there's really not a choice. So how do you create both an identity and a difference that weaves together? I think it's a two-pronged article that in a sense respect the individuality and also respect the unity. And I think that's a difficult weave. That's it. It's kind of like cooking. You gotta add the spice in the right way.
Yeah.
That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I mean, this is the tough problem, right? I mean, on the one hand, we're all different. We have different gifts. And as the ancients believed, the purpose of education is to allow those different gifts to flower. And you can't do that by treating everybody the same way. You have to treat people different. You have to pay attention to what is growing in people, what's developing, who are they, what are the seeds of the future that are already within them, what's their possibilities. And so you can't do a cookie cutter stamp out education, or else you end up suppressing either almost everybody or everybody's gifts. Like the modern approach is we're all going to take the same tests, we're all going to be given the same facts, and the education doesn't consist of learning who you are and what your gifts are and developing them to the max. An education consists of memorizing facts and regurgitating them on tests to get an A, and that those facts and skills are not focused on what does society need or what do you need, either one. They're focused on how can I turn you into a useful, interchangeable tool. People are people, people are not people, they're human resources to be fitted into corporations as needed in order to, achieve short-term objectives in the marketplace. And that's our concept of education and human nature and so forth. It's crazed. We talk about freedom everywhere in all our founding documents, but the obsession with uniformity and making everybody the same demonstrates that we actually believe we're as antagonistic to freedom as you could get. Because under real conditions of freedom, each person would develop those gifts that they have in whatever direction they take them. And that's the last thing in the world our systems want. We want you to fit the role that we've hired you for, that we're educating you for. It's a problem. I mean, I don't think that the Greeks hit the balance right either, but we certainly don't hit the balance right. And education has been my obsession since I was a teenager. How do you design curricula? How do you teach people? And the one thing I can say about it is just nobody's got this figured out. Obvious. It's just patently obvious. No one has this figured out. So let's talk about this issue. I'm going to take us back to Heraclitus fragment 2 again, because this gives us the issue. I did it last week, but I made some modifications during the week. I did some more translation here. And what we have here in this fragment, which I'll read the wheelwright translation first, which says, "We should let ourselves be guided by what is common to all. Yet, although the logos is common to all, most men live as if each of them had a private intelligence of his own." And as we talked about last week, Wheelwright's made a mistake here. He's better than most of the translators. He's made a couple of mistakes in this, and one of them is the word phronesin, which is the last word of Greek in the Greek part up above. Phronesin, that does not translate to intelligence. I mean, you can. It's like one of the words that's in the definitions, but it's inadequate. All the other words in the definition of phronesis add qualities that are not captured by the English word of intelligence. And as we said last week, it's closer to say self-providence. Do you know what's healthy for you? Do you care about what's healthy to you? Do you even notice what's healthy to you? Or are you too busy looking at other things to do what's healthy for you? Phronesis is the capacity that most other animals have, but that we don't have. That they notice and are drawn to, and they act toward what is ultimately healthy for them and their species. And this is missing in Homo sapiens. We notice and are drawn to, and we act on idiotic impulses, by which we don't mean dumb. We don't mean poo-poo head impulses. We mean whatever our own framework is, whatever our own mental obsessions are, that's what we orient towards, regardless of whether it's healthy for us or not. And this is the problem between us and the other animals, is that we're weak on this. So he's saying the logos is right there. The logos, the underlying logic of the world that makes all the trees grow and makes the cheetah chase the gazelle, and that led to our evolution. It's right there in front of us. Everywhere we turn, the logos is at work. We share it, right? It's common. It's a shared legacy or heritage that we have in common, and that it has been successful for billions of years. Well, Heraclitus didn't even think it was billions of years. He thought the world existed forever. He thought it was longer than that. But, our measurement of the earth is billions of years. At least on this planet, the logos has been at work. And there it is, right in front of our faces. And yet, even though it's right there, we live as though it's not there at all. We live as though there is no shared phronesis. There is no common concept of health and health giving and what's good for us. We live as though we each had our own ideas, and those ideas were not idiosyncratic and idiotic like the Greeks thought, but were sacred. They were the highest law. Whatever I want must be the best thing in the world. Whatever I want other people to do, they should obey me. There's this tyrannical impulse in us where we believe that we possess a private phronesis that other people lack and that the world lacks, and that we're better than they are. We know, I know, in my idiocy, I know how Phil should be spending his life. And if we get into a discussion and he starts telling me about the things he's doing, I want to kibitz and tell him where he's going wrong. And I do that because I live as if I had a private phronesis of my own. But Heraclitus's point is, I don't. A cheetah has a private phronesis of its own, but Homo sapiens, each of us does not have a private phronesis of our own. We have this idiocy that we mistake for self-providence and the pursuit of health. And we can't tell them apart. It's as though we couldn't tell food from poison. It's insane. As a species, the worst thing in the world is for the species to not know what's good for it and to not take an interest in what's good for it. Or God help us not even to notice what's good for it. But people do this every day. Each of us does it every day. It's so easy for us to be led into other systems of organization that have nothing to do with what's healthy. So this is what he's talking about. So phronesis, that's one of the things I want to talk about that's wrong in the translation. The second thing I want to talk about in the translation, he says, most men live as if each of them had a private intelligence of his own. And the Greek that he's translating there is hoi polloi. Hoi polloi. I'm going to drop that into the chat right here. That is one of the favorite phrases in Greek. It means the many, right? Polloi is related to poly. Hoi is the. It's a modified form of the. The many, right? This is the many. And there are other places in the Heraclitus fragments where Wheelwright does translate this and related phrases as the many. And once you see the many, you realize Plato talks about the many all the time. The many gets dropped in dialogue after dialogue after dialogue. Aristotle talks about the many all the time. The many show up in tragic plays and lyric poetry. It's a major preoccupation of the Greeks. And this is coming right out of the text that I was talking about with Kenneth Smith, where he says, in the case of the mass of idiotes, he wrote, one way to read that is hoi polloi, right? That is to say, Kenneth Smith is trying in English to say what is so much easier to say in ancient Greek. How do you convey to an English-speaking person this problem that the majority of people think that their idiocy is wisdom, and that they cling to their idiocy like they would cling to a life raft if they were adrift at sea? They think it's the most important thing and the best thing. They don't understand that it's the trap that they need to escape, right? They have mistaken poison for food is what they've done. That's what he's talking about when he talks about in the case of the mass of idiotes. And that's what Heraclitus means here when he says hoi polloi. But, Wheelwright isn't exactly, he's an academic. He doesn't fully grasp the ancient worldview. He's got parts of it, but he'll say most men when it really means the many. It is most men, but it's a bigger problem than that. It's a specific group with a specific nature, a specific character, as Sharon says. And it's the character that is the problem. And if you could help them overcome that problem in any way, if they weren't pushing you back whenever you tried to intervene, maybe they could get out of that trap. But otherwise, it's unless their character is such that even though right now they may be a doulos or a benausos, but they've still got seeds within them that would allow them under the right circumstances to develop further into an Aristos. And unless the right circumstances arise in their life to trigger those seeds in their character, without those two things, they'll just be stuck there forever as sort of a partially developed human being from the Greek perspective. They're like a cheetah that can only crawl. They're like a cheetah that takes no interest in gazelles or anything else you could eat. Occasionally they notice a gazelle and go, ooh. You might find a cheetah now and then in this half state, if in the metaphor, this imaginary cheetah that mostly doesn't pay attention to gazelles, but sometimes if it's in the right mood, it notices a gazelle, but then it tries to crawl after it because it never learned to run. What you're seeing here is not using Aristotle's phrasing, you're not seeing the arete of the cheetah at work. And it's in the same way when you look at the hoi polloi. The hoi polloi do not demonstrate the arete of Homo sapiens at work. There's some sort of not fully developed form, like an infant. And just like you wouldn't let an infant vote about whether to, crawl to the edge of a cliff or to touch a hot stove, so the Greeks believe it would be equally wrong to expect the hoi polloi to take an interest in good governance. Give them the opportunity to govern, and they're just going to satisfy their appetites and ideologies, which is what they're dying to do. That's the idiocy that they love so much. What they want, they think, is a god. What they believe, they think, is a god. They think everybody else should submit to it. The idea that they should be questioning themselves. The whole idea that they should not be so confident about their opinions. That they should be always looking for the trap of their own mind and trying to figure out how to get out of it. All of that's alien to them. They wouldn't believe that ever. Unless they develop further, which they haven't done yet. The other part that's here, hoi polloi, the other part I want to talk about is most men live as if each of them had a private intelligence of his own. And that is the next two words after hoi polloi. Hos idion, the private. And the idion is an inflected form of idios, an idiot. That is to say, the private is inherently idiotic. The idiotic is inherently private. And it would be because the definition is one's own. One's own things are one's private things. There is a circularity and coherency to this definition. And it's why, a couple of things I'll touch on here to try to draw out the full meaning. It's why, to the Greeks, the Trojan War was an abomination, looking back on it. Because a marriage, right? Infidelity in a marriage, a wife running away from home. This is the stuff not of politics, which is public. This is the stuff of the oikos, the home, which is private. It's as though you were called to speak at the political assembly and you dropped your pants and masturbated in front of everybody. They're like, dear God, what's that doing in the public space? That's the stuff you do at home. That's your icky private things that you have to do for your own biology. It's like feeding yourself or taking a shower or pooping, right? The Greeks believed there had to be an absolute separation of the public and private realms. And if the private stuff comes out into public, it's disgusting and dangerous. The hoi polloi worship their private things and try to push them on the world. Their desires, they try to push on people. Their ideologies, they try to push on people. And the classical Greek perspective is, it's as though they took a dump in church on the altar. That stuff has no business being out here where we're trying to talk about, what the policy should be for the Peloponnesian War. Those things, it's wrong at a deep, visceral, and sacred level. That's the level, that's how they felt about it. So to say the hoi polloi live as if each of them had a private phronesis of their own. Phronesis is your action out in the world, right? It's your capacity to choose your actions correctly in the pursuit of health. But you can't do that if you're obsessed with your own private things. So the idea of a private intelligence of your own is inherently a contradiction in terms to the ancient worldview, which is hard for us to understand because we're all about privacy. We're obsessed with, private interests are good interests. What you want is what you should get. And, the only question is, how do you get it? The purpose of politics is for you to get what you want by going out there and engaging, you know, in debate and discussion and elections and so forth. In other words, we have elevated the things that were supposed to stay in the bathroom and the bedroom to the level of national policy debates, which is exactly how the Greeks thought that their ancestors had destroyed Bronze Age civilization. What we take for granted as the normal, correct way to live, they saw as the catastrophe that they've already experienced and had to claw their way out of through a long dark age. They would look on what we do with horror in confusing these realms and of failing to understand the dangers of human appetite and human ideology, not just failing to understand them, but instead exalting them as though they're good things. And all of this would be taken for granted. They just, I mean, these aren't things that they would rationally have to debate and discuss. They just know that this is true. Just like we know the opposite is true. So this is where we're seeing a clash of worldviews. They're incompatible. There isn't a compromise between them. It's not that these represent two extremes and this is some kind of spectrum. And if we could just find the middle of the herd and hide in there from the predators, we would have the truth. That's not it at all. These are incompatible worldviews. They can't compromise with each other. The only way to resolve them is with some other third thing that somehow has its own different structure that pulls together the strengths of both of them in a new configuration, inconceivable by either of them. That would be the only way to reconcile what the advantages of one with the advantages of the other, because they're blocked by that incompatibility. This is what Kenneth's talking about. He's alluding to all of this in these sentences. He says, neither law nor equality would be possible in the economy, and democracy would devolve into a political Babel. He's trying to say Aristotle would be horrified by the way we run our economy and politics. That's what he's trying to say. And that Aristotle wouldn't be horrified because he's primitive or stupid or backwards, all of which we believe, right? Because he was 2,500 years ago, and we know that things from the past are bad and things from the present are good. We know he would be wrong to feel that way, but our reasons for feeling that way are ideological. They don't actually make sense. Whereas his critique of us has deep philosophical roots and could be explained in great detail. This is what we spent 98 weeks so far digging into. How did the ancients see the world? It coheres, right? If you believe ethos anthropoi daimon, if you believe character is fate, and that the only way to change your fate is to cultivate your character, and if you see that most people don't engage in cultivating their character, you know that their behavior is fated, which makes them less individuals than more sort of symptoms of their beliefs and appetites, then it's going to change the way you think about politics and the organization of society at a deep level. Aristotle could explain all that. His beliefs make sense within their own terms, within the frame of the worldview. It's not a primitive version or a mistaken version compared to ours. It is a different, alternative perspective on the world, which has its advantages and disadvantages. And some of the advantages that it has over modernity are things that we desperately need, because they bring clarity to issues that moderns can't seem to figure out for themselves. There are ways in which we keep repeating the same stupid mistakes over and over and over. Because for us, the only way to stop making that mistake would be to see the world differently than the way we see it. Every time we reapproach the problem, our worldview resupplies the same answers in advance before we start thinking about it. They frame us into a labyrinth. We can't get out of the trap. We can't recognize that we're in the trap until we get out of the worldview and look from a new perspective. Like Daedalus with the wings flying out of the labyrinth, right? As long as he stayed in a two-dimensional world, he couldn't get out. The labyrinth was designed to defeat any way that he could turn as he walked about, only by flying out. So that he's not turning at all. Could he look back and look at the design of the labyrinth and see how it had trapped him? That's what it is when you only have one worldview, no matter which one you pick. There isn't a right worldview anywhere. They're all mortal constructs. And as mortal constructs, they're all wildly inadequate to the task of describing an infinite world. But to us, they feel convincing. We're sure we're right. And that certainty is the walls of the labyrinth itself. And that's why we can't get out. So anyway, yes, well, Stephen's right. Agamemnon thought that Menelaus and Agamemnon thought that Helen was property stolen by Paris. So they could call it a theft, but that was their interpretation. Before I call on Phil and Joe, Donald, you had your hand up and then you put it down, but I'm sure you were going to say something interesting. Would you like to come off mute and tell us what the interesting thing is? He says, no, I'm just going to make my video turn off. You can't see me.
I was having trouble clicking. I was going to say, but you kept getting better and better at the intersection of the idiotic and the aristocratic there, or the aristic, which is something last week I was glad to see that we were getting to. But I kept thinking about this. There was a book a few years back, you know, What's the Problem with Kansas, or something like that, about the people in Kansas don't know their own interest, and so vote the wrong way. And I kept thinking about how this discussion opens up how you might interpret that. Are the people in Kansas not idiotic and have obtained some broader view that allows them to vote against their own personal interest in favor of something else, and therefore they have become, in a sense, self-provident? Or are they just benighted? You know, this kind of framework lets you see that situation. And I'm not trying to answer it. I have no facts about the people of Kansas or what choices they've made. But are they, you know, which way is it? Are they truly idiotic, or are they self-provident? Because either way could produce the kind of result that we see. That is, it opens up more ways to interpret situations and to consider, you know, was the author really suggesting that they become more idiotic and therefore focus more closely on their private interest? That may not be what we want. You know, I don't know. I think I bought the book when it was popular, but I didn't spend much time reading it. But it did, to me, trigger this kind of question here about how we see situations, and then with a little Kenneth Smith in the background, we can see them as in alternative ways. And that's largely what I think Kenneth wants us to be able to do with these worldviews. And I might say, just on the topic of worldviews, is that it seems to me to be part of like what Hegel called, you know, the unthought, not the unconscious, but the unthought. It's like water to fish. Now, we have much better ideas about, or much better formulations about ancient worldviews and medieval worldviews, because they're over, than we do about our own, because we're still in the middle of it. You know, I would say, like, from medieval to modern, when there was a change from we want to be ruled by God to consent of the governed, was a big shift in worldviews as to where authority lies. Does it lie with God, or does it lie with the individual? And we've talked about that in the past. and I think Fei Ling, I'm sorry, name Ms. Ling,
Fei Wuling.
Fei Wu Ling, yeah, might be, because we are getting to say if the medieval to the modern was from rule by God to rule by consent of the government, we're now seeing very strong, and from the 20th century on, strong forces that say no consent is required. You know, it is might makes right, and it's might all the way down, not consent. You know, so we may be, there may be other signs like that too, that we would apply sort of a Smithian analysis to indicate that we are closer to the end of modernity, or I don't know, you can't tell. I'm not a prophet. I wouldn't know. Anybody that listens to me is an idiot, and a modern idiot, not just, of course, if you were an ancient idiot, you wouldn't be listening to me either. You'd be only listening to yourself. But yeah. Oh yeah, and I like Helen. You know that the Helen is the standard of womanly beauty. It's beauty sufficient to sail a single ship. Enough.
Okay, I love the idea of a millihelen.
Thank you for expressing our thoughts, Donald.
Yeah, thanks, man. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Sorry, what did Donald say about Helen?
What was that?
What did Donald say about Helen that made you guys laugh?
He said you can think of one Helen as a measure of beauty capable of launching 1,000 ships, right? The face that launched 1,000 ships is the famous quote about Helen. He says if that's true, then under the metric system, you could say a millihelen is a sufficient amount of beauty to launch one ship. So someone who's beautiful enough that someone will launch one ship in pursuit of her, you know, that person has one millihelen of beauty. This is a typical description of how moderns want to turn everything into metrics and systems. And the Greeks, of course, didn't mean that way when they said Helen launched 1,000 ships. But the modern perspective, it's sort of irresistible to want to turn things into millihelens. And, you know, there's a few millihelens right here on this call, I'm sure. So yeah, Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was interesting.
You know, I guess in a way I got lost in the politics of the polis. In a way, I think that's certainly very important. But I got sort of intrigued by the fact of framing, in the sense that language is such an important part that mediates our concepts and our understanding of the world. And I got lost by the idea, like, to what degree should language be, I shouldn't say ambiguous is one way of putting it, because that's like poetic, but multifractal may be another way. And to what degree language should be precise, A leads to B, that's it. And to what degree, because that seemed like a really important distinction, because it seems to me, and really it's related to development in a sense, really to a degree that, in a sense, by leaving it multifractal or ambiguous, it requires consciousness of interpretation, and understanding is much more complex than we could put a sufficient focus on it immediately. But on the other hand, it seems to me precise language is needed, because I would hate to, let's say, go to a surgery and the guy brings in either a high priest or a poet and just recites beautiful Shakespeare, and I expect to come out whole. I mean, like, it seems to be we have to play at both ends to a certain degree. And maybe that's where we should have, in a sense, a much more fluid, dynamic, poetic language for regular existence because life is so complex. But on the other hand, we need technical language in every discipline because we want as little ambiguity as possible because we got to make a choice that's correct. It's not like it's probably correct. You know, he might die, but most likely he won't. I mean, that doesn't sound right. Even though that probably is true, you know, you don't want to say, you know, because your hands would be very nervous trying to save the guy's life. So how do we deal with the fact that there are these two very, very distinct, important distinction between language and where does, and I guess in that sense, where does politics come into that? How precise should the language be? And some people will complain like, you know, you're not precise enough in explaining what this is. And other people would believe that, you know, that's the whole point because I can't be more precise about what's happening in the Middle East right now between, you know, Iran and, I mean, between Hamas and Israel. And so that's a kind of important part. And it seems to me like that's awesome. Is that part of the development of human beings? Because we're not born with what we absolutely need to do, but in fact is structured by the fact that we grow up in a family and we grow up in a thing that in a sense begin to train the framing of what things are, and we begin to learn the language in this way. So without, and maybe that's what distinguishes us from, let's say, an antelope, because like within 5 minutes, the antelope would stand up and start walking around and maybe start running soon. Whereas like, you know, a baby, you know, like poor kid, I mean, like it's absolutely dependent on this sort of gradual training because as development seems to be happening, that's part of what human existence is about. And so he begins to learn the framing, depending what it is. Then we have a society where all variations of framing in relationship, we go into politics and understand how that works. Could you say something about that? Because it seems like those are very important. And the Greeks seems to love the fact that language is multifactorial. It is not just like, oh, this means exactly this, and that's all we have it. Until Plato discovered geometry and decided, you know, that's a much more precise way of doing things. Could you say something about that? Because I seem to be trapped in this, I wouldn't say ambiguity, but a duality. That on the one hand, you know, you need to be more ambiguous because to leave the potentiality unexplained. On the other hand, you need to be precise. You know, when somebody says, "What do you mean by that?" Is that, well, you know, you then you get technical. You know, only when the technique is applicable. That's it, Phil. Will you say something about that?
Yeah, so Phil, the Greeks didn't have good answers on this subject. They argued about the meanings of words a lot and the significance of them. They cherished their language to a degree that makes English only people in America look like they don't care about English at all. The Greeks were obsessed with Greek, the language, and they thought that's why the fundamental definition of a barbarian is it's someone who doesn't speak Greek. I mean, you know, we would think, is it, you don't share the religion? Are you of a different race? It's all these things we would say would define a Greek. And the Greeks are like, that stuff's secondary. The important thing is, do you speak our language? Because our language is the best. They were real, you know, they were real jingoistic about their language. And, you know, it's not a perfect language. It's got its flaws, some of which are easier to see from a different worldview than theirs. But it's also easy to see that there are some incredible strengths in their language. The fact that they are so highly inflected and that you can derive so many related terms from any word, just a whole constellation of words. You know, the word for the process of a certain mode of thinking, first of all, that they've got words for the different modes of thinking, but then you've got a word for the process, you've got a word for the product, you know, what is a thought? that is produced by that process. They can distinguish. They don't have a generic word for thought. They have a word for, a thought that's produced this way versus a thought that's produced that way. They have the word for the kind of thinker who thinks this way versus the kind of thinker who thinks that way. Now, that's just 3 examples, but they can make dozens and dozens and dozens of words out of any one of their words. It's just amazing. So I kind of understand to some point why they were so obsessed with their language. But despite that focus and attention, which was far more than what we do, they still had many unresolved issues about what their words meant. There's a lot of the words are used variously in different times and places in Greece, which we would expect, languages drift, but they're also sometimes used variously at the exact same time in the exact same place. Plato has dialogues where the speakers are debating the significance of some word, for example. They don't quite agree. And you really see the differences if you consider Heraclitus and Parmenides. They never did, as far as I know, but imagine them sitting down to debate the meanings of the words being and change. That could turn into a knockdown, drag out fight right there. So I don't think that they solved this problem. It's endemic to the human condition. And you're absolutely right that you both need the ability to speak precisely, and you need the ability to speak generally. And I don't know if I don't know whether there's a human language that has solved the problem of making it absolutely clear when you mean it which way. Am I speaking precisely or am I speaking loosely? In English, you have to actually add the phrase, am I speaking precisely or loosely? And mostly we forget to do that. And then your reader is free to misinterpret which way you meant it. And then we have flame wars on the internet. I think a language that solved the problems you're talking about would be a language in which you could they could set up an internet and be speaking in their typing in their language, and they wouldn't have flame wars because they know what they mean. They understand each other, which we only sort of do. I can't remember if it was Churchill or somebody else who said America and England are 2 countries divided by a common language. But I sometimes think, as funny as that is, it's almost funnier and more tragic that any 2 English speakers anywhere in the world are divided by their shared language, because we only vaguely have an idea of what we mean by the words we say, and the other people have even less of a clear idea what on earth we meant. But sadly, both we and they are often very sure about what the words mean, even if we interpret it in opposite ways. And this is the challenge of reading Kenneth Smith or reading anything written by an ancient or a medieval. It is a fundamental problem of the human condition, and it's a deep one. And I think it reflects the fact that language is so new in our species. Sophisticated language, we're still looking for evidence about how far back our language went in our species. It's not clear how much we were speaking 400,000 years ago. Probably not 0, but almost certainly not tens of thousands of words, just based on what we're seeing. And of course, new things in evolution are things that aren't very well tested yet. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I just found it very, very interesting. You mentioned about, you're talking about schools and how we treat everybody, kind of the same as almost a cog in the wheel. And I think that that's a really important point when I was thinking about this, this sentence here, that we should let ourselves be guided by what is common to all. Because what is common to all is our humanity, the ability to understand ourselves. And that once we have that understanding of ourselves, we start to see our flaws and what is common to each other. But if you're a cog in the wheel, then you don't necessarily see that. You have a very narrow perspective on the world. So when we're educated, our values become set for us. They're not our values anymore. So we just become part of this process. And so from there, it's like our desires, what is actually worth pursuing or what is good, are then manufactured. And this is what what Donald was saying, how we end up actually voting against our own self-interests. because our views are distorted by this, kind of system that is based on nothing more than not necessarily focused on what it means to be a good citizen or a good person, but what's actually, what are you going to get out of it? And so I think that that's where, people become, less interested in doing what was the right thing. So I really think it kind of relates directly to what you're talking about when, how the education is related to allowing, us to pursue what is good for all. I mean, because we can't even discern what that is. And part of that also, and as I mentioned already, is that inability to really fully understand the uniqueness of each individual. By not doing that, we're unable to see what's common to all. Because it's when you look internally, that's when you finally understand yourself and you can understand the connection between you and everyone else. But if you don't do that, if you only look at what's being taught to you in school and how you're going to be a cog in the wheel, then you don't look at what's common to everyone. You just look at what objects you want. And so, you kind of lose the humanity in that process. So it is interesting to think of it from that perspective, because I think that everybody here probably to some extent can say that, that our worldview has been distorted by, at least, in the United States, by a lot of what education values, as opposed to, and when I say education, I'm talking about it in very specific format, in a very mechanistic way, versus what we actually value. And I think that lack of introspection is a real problem in knowing how to pursue what is good. That's all. There's a gap in our understanding. And I think that there's also this aspect of it, when you're only looking externally for things, you're only going to look for things that you can see as well, as opposed to adhering to some types of principles. Anyway, that gets a little bit more abstract. Anyway, that's just a quick thought.
It's good, Joe. Thank you. And it looks like Sharon wants to add something to that. So go ahead, Sharon. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I just wanted to follow up on what Joe said, because, and it adds on to what Donald said. And Donald started out by saying, why the people in Kansas would vote against their own interests. And I think it probably has to do, in my opinion, with the second feature of character, phronesis, the ability to use your experience to develop practical wisdom. And in doing so, it depends on whether you become, and this is too a thing that I've noticed, use it to become reflexive or reflective. Reflective requires critical thinking. Reflexive is just part of the worldview, part of the culture. You just don't think about it at all. And it really has nothing to do with education, I'm sorry to say, whether you're reflexive or reflective. It just depends on what you want to do or what you want to believe and the group you want to belong to, right? Because being reflective takes courage and strength, and being reflexive is the easy one. So I thought that would kind of just follow up both on what Donald said and what Joe said. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, that issue of reflective versus reflexive, that goes very close to what we've been talking about here. It's like the definition of the hoi polloi that people were concerned about is that they're reflexive and not reflective. And the definition of the aristoi is those are the people who are reflective, who are willing to suppress their initial reflex in order to try to escape the trap of their own minds. their own, to try to develop their character further, to try to know who the hell they are and what they want. Part of what the Greeks are concerned about is the fact that you have all these people who are eager to go in and tell everybody else what to do, and yet they don't even know who they are. They don't know what they are. They don't know their own character. They don't know what's growing in them. They might dream of being a dancer, but they might have no gift at all for dance. The gift they have might be for something entirely different. They might be a lot happier if they pursued their other gift, or at least more fulfilled, as people. But because they don't know themselves, they pursue the wrong thing, and it makes them unhappy. He talks in this text repeatedly in this chapter. He refers to the way that the Greeks looked out and saw people wrecking their own lives, but always pointing at something else as the cause of the problem. And Joe gave us the term, I think 3 or 4 months ago, the phrase agency versus contingency. And that the outcome of our lives is neither all agency nor all contingency, but is this complicated dialectic between the two. But people who are not reflective deny that. They don't want it to be a dialectic. They want it to be simple, like they think. They want it to be at the level that they think at. And so, either they'll say nothing's my fault, everything is the fault of these forces outside myself, or if they're successful in life, they flip-flop and say, I got here entirely by my own skills. I didn't have any help at all. I lifted myself up by my own bootstraps, a phrase that was originally invented to mock the idea that people get anywhere without an enormous amount of help. So who's able to be reflective enough and to struggle enough to wrestle with these issues? These are the same people that Kenneth Smith's talking about and that Heraclitus is referring to here. So I'm really glad you brought those up. There are all kinds of interesting issues here. I put the link to Thucydides' Myth Historicus again, like I did last week, because I'm almost done reading it now, and the later chapters get just better and better and better. He just keeps talking about not just what went wrong in Athens that led to the Peloponnesian War. He really does blame Athens more than he blames Sparta. Not that he's letting Sparta off the hook, but he's like, Athens was toxic at that point. But he also really pulls apart the Greek worldview. It really makes a great supplement to chapter 4 of Kenneth's book, because he's really bringing out terms that to the Greeks meant something very different than they mean to us. And I'm just going to give a very short example before I call on Ginny, which I'll do in a second. And it's the word elpis, which means hope. Elpis means hope. Doesn't that sound nice? Hope's a good thing, right? We all know hope is a good thing, not a bad thing, but not to the Greeks. To the Greeks, elpis was a bad thing. And so an example of that is that the Athenians have an early victory against the Spartans, and their hopes leap up wildly, and they think, man, we're just amazing. This is so cool. I bet we could also conquer Syracuse and Sicily. So in the middle of their fight with Sparta, they launch a gigantic fleet off to Sicily, halfway across the Mediterranean, and go pick a fight. This is like Napoleon picking a fight with Russia while he's still trying to fight the rest of Europe, which led to the downfall of Napoleon. The exact same thing happened over 1,000 years before with the Athenians. And he says, the problem is the Greeks had this concept about how do people of virtue fall? How does a tragic fall happen? What are the stages in the tragic fall? And they talk about how Aeschylus lays it out carefully, one step at a time in the Agamemnon, and how Thucydides has organized the structure of his history of the Peloponnesian War to show the exact same tragic sequence, one step at a time, as the Athenians are led by their hubris, by early successes that were partially caused by luck, but that they insisted were not, that they were insisted were caused entirely by their own excellence, and that caused overweening hubris and elpis to leap up and lead them to think, I can do so much more than I'm doing now. And thus they doubled the size of the war and destroyed themselves. It led to the collapse of Athens, the end of the golden age of Athens, because of hope. Now that's a completely different interpretation of hope than what moderns have. And I got to say, it took me a few hours of reading before I could make my peace with it and say, because for me, hope has always been very important in my life. But this idea of wild hope that goes too far, manic hope that leads us to overreach, Yeah, I can totally see how to the Greeks this would be a normal stage in the process of a tragic fall, and that they would see it everywhere they looked. They'd be looking out, they'd be asking themselves the question, is that person possessed by Elpis? What about that person? It's just a natural question they would ask. And it's a question that no modern would ask because we don't have the word Elpis and we don't interpret hope that way that they do. It's the worldview in action, right? Change is what's foreground and what's background. Ginny, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, I forgot to take my hand down from previous, and sorry, I have nothing on my mind.
Okay, thanks, Ginny.
Enjoy listening to you as always.
Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
And the first thing I want to respond to is now I've been getting to understand very much why the Greek thing, moderation is a virtue, right? In other words, it's good to have hope, but not too much. It's good to have one drink, but maybe not five. So that's a good beginning. I want to address the issue that Sharon bring up. It's kind of an important issue, but I'll first say this. About 2 months ago, I was in a meeting. It's a local meeting. We were talking about politics, and this Indian guy. So you have to understand he's Indian. He made this very clever statement that I admire him for saying, but I thought about it later. And he says, in India, we teach people not only to cast our votes, but to vote or cast. Of course, you have to understand it within the Indian context. That's absolutely makes sense, right? Vote for your own interests, in your caste. So that's interesting. So I'm thinking about that. Yeah, that does seem very tribal, and I could see how India, because it is a democracy, but it's a democracy that's very segmented. I mean, India is in fact maybe a half a dozen or more countries that's unified as a confederation. So in that sense, voting for your caste it's a very important structure. But I think getting to what Sharon said, I used this metaphor before, and Sharon helped me in the sense of reflexivity and refractivity. Okay, reflectivity and reflexivity, and the thing about what is this? I keep forgetting his name. The guy who looked for his mirror in the pool of water. What's his name again now?
Narcissus.
Narcissus, yes. When Narcissus looked into the pool and then saw the reflection, he actually saw the reflection. He only saw the surface, which is not reflection, but what was the word you used, Sharon?
Reflexive versus reflective?
Yeah, reflexive versus reflective. And I think if he looked deeper, he would have heard the echoes of echoing within him, okay? Because she was projecting love toward him. And he would begin to look deeper within rather than the surface structure, and saw that within him was the other. I think if we all understand that within ourselves is otherness, then we begin to see how we are related to humanity in general. And I think when you only see the reflection on the surface, then you're not getting into the depth of thinking within and the depth of thought that allows you to have the deep thinking about your relationship to otherness. And I think that's a difficult thing for us to do. But particularly for those of us who are very egotistical, we only see ourselves in the reflection, and we don't begin to look inwards and see how it also spills out outward into the otherness. Because if we don't do that, then we are by ourselves, and we don't see the structure of relationships that's within us, and we have to settle that within ourselves first before we could settle it within the external world. And I think otherwise, I guess you could say no man stands alone, and that's an important part. I think that also addressed what Joe was saying too, So that's an important thing, that we could see that we have to struggle within ourselves to see the otherness within ourselves, because we do live in a community. That's it. Thank you, Sharon.
Can I just say one thing? Yes. Well,
Yeah, I would love you to.
I just wanted to emphasize that a physical reflection and an internal reflection are two different things, right? Whether or not one can lead to the other, I'm not sure, because physical reflection, looking in the water and seeing yourself reflected, or looking in the mirror and seeing yourself reflected, again, requires courage and strength and really a certain depth to really come up with the meaning of it. So when I say reflective, it's an internal process for me. And that's why I said it's based on the number 2 issue in character, which is the development of practical wisdom. Phronesis, that's what you called it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm going to call on Donald and Joe in a second. I just want to add something else that was from the Thucydides Myth Historicus. He talks about another stage in the process, and there's another distinction he makes. He talks about, in the earlier book, From Religion to Philosophy, he talks about the difference between philia and nekos, where philia is the force that draws the tribe together to act in a coherent, healthy way, whereas nekos is the countervailing force that causes the tribe to split apart into factions. And that, in the modern world, tribalism is an insult, right? We say if someone is being tribal, we mean they're being divisive. But the Greeks, whose society was based on tribes, had a keener sense of this, and they distinguished tribalism in these two different ways. They said, you can have tribalism that's based on philia, and that's a unifying force in the world that leads to peace. But you can also have tribalism that's based on nekos, and that's what splits us apart. I'll just type those into the chat here so that we don't lose them. Philia versus nekos. But in the present book, Thucydides Myth Historicus, he talks about a different kind of love than philia. He talks about eros. And in the modern world, eros, is supposed to be good. You can tell from the advertisements, we're all supposed to be sexy all the time. We're all supposed to desire each other all the time. We're all supposed to have, from the movies and TV shows, we're supposed to be teetering on the edge of passionately kissing each other at every moment. Two people will be in a fight, and then abruptly they begin kissing and making out, and it's like, what the hell just happened? This is the world that we fantasize about, is all these people just bursting with hormones, desperate to have sex, and to us that's eros, right? Is that adolescent desire to have sex all the time. When we think of Aphrodite, we think of her as, maybe she has philia in her, but she definitely has eros and beauty, right? And that those must all be good things together, because love is good. That's what Christianity teaches us, love is good. But we're using the word love to cover a lot of ground. We're using it to not only cover philia, which genuinely brings us together into a greater whole, but we're also using it to cover eros. And when he's describing how Thucydides explains the tragic fall of Athens, he says, in between hubris and elpis is eros, that the Athenian faction that was interested in trade above all things, the Banausoi, conceived an eros for Sicily and Syracuse. They wanted it so bad. Their desire led them they were already hubristic, but when you combine that with eros, it leads to elpis. That is to say, their longing to control the trade to the West is what led them to the elpis of daring to believe that they could fight a war on two fronts just because they wanted it. And so from this perspective, eros is seen as a destructive force. Eros is the kind of desire that Heraclitus is warning us about when he says it would not be better if men got what they wanted. Not even if they got exactly what they wanted. It won't come out the way they think it does. Desire is blind. And he's there clearly talking about eros in the same sense that Thucydides means it when he's describing the faction in Athens that desperately wants Sicily and will do anything to get it. So just like they're anatomizing the stages of tragic fall in a level of fine detail that we don't do in English, they're even anatomizing things like love at a level of sophistication that we don't do, and distinguishing between healthy, constructive love versus unhealthy, destructive love. And for them, the goddess Aphrodite, she's not just some cute, hot wench that you want to marry or have sex with. She is the embodiment of both of those things at the same time, which is why she's scary, dangerous. It's why an entire war could be fought over Aphrodite effectively through the person of Helen. That desire is good and bad at the same time in a very scary way that the Greeks were prepared to understand because that was their ancestors who screwed everything up over desire, but in a way that we're really not prepared to desire, since all of our news and all of our TV shows and movies and stories all tell us that love is good and only good, and it couldn't ever be anything else. There's a famous, not well known, but in horror circles, there's a famous French horror film called Eyes Without a Face. And one of the things that I do when I study horror films is I'm saying, what is the object of fear? What is the thing that you're being told, that the story is telling you should be afraid of? And Eyes Without a Face is about a plastic surgeon who is responsible for a car accident in which his daughter's face is all scarred up. And he feels terribly guilty about it. So what does he do? He says, well, I'm a great surgeon. I could transplant another face onto her. Where am I going to get another face? So he runs around France murdering people, pretty people, to take their faces and try to graft them onto his daughter. Now, to moderns, that's not just gross, it's wrong. We're not really willing to come to grips with it. But the Greeks would totally understand that his desire, his love of his daughter leads to his desire to be willing to go beyond what other people will morally do in order to try to, satiate his own guilt. It's love in the dark aspect that's driving the terror in this film. And it's very well acted and written. I mean, it's a black and white film. It's not a modern gory film or anything. It's not a gore fest. But it's about the existential situation. And now that I've read this Thucydides Myth Historicus, I can see how that's a Greek perspective on love. That love is both a blessing and a curse. It all depends on how you express that love and whether your relationship to your feelings is that of a slave, right, where you just do whatever you feel, or whether it's an adult, mature relationship in which you have a dialectic between how you feel and whether you think that's right and what you want to do. All this stuff is really complex. And you don't see that kind of sophisticated treatment of issues like this very often in the modern world. But in the Greeks, it was taken for granted. I mean, the whole history of the Peloponnesian War is the story of, among other things, and so's the Trojan War, the story of, desire as both good and bad, depending on how it's expressed in a person. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, Pandora and her jar. Pandora's a Greek name, means all gifts. God's giving man all gifts there through Pandora. When she opened her jar, hope stuck to the rim, not knowing whether it was a gift or not, because hope is often how you crush men, crush their hopes. It's not a gift. unless of course it's keeping men alive to do better. You know, it's that same duality.
Thank you, Donald. And this is the stuff that Francis Cornford talks about in this chapter in Thucydides Mythostoricus. He talks about Pandora. And he says, you know, the modern perspective of the story is all these terrible evils escape into the world out of the chest. Talk about gifts. Those are some terrible gifts the gods gave us, you know, disease, famine, all those horrible things, they escape. But she keeps hope in the chest, and thus the phrase a hope chest, you know, that redounds throughout history. And we all think, well, that's sweet that we managed to hang on to hope despite all the terrible things that happen. But of course, it's not a modern story, it's a Greek story. And the word that they used wouldn't have been hope because they don't speak English. They would have used the word elpis, which really, once you know what elpis is, raises the question, is that supposed to be a happy ending? That there's hope in there? Or are they saying we're being set up for tragedy through overweening hope and overreaching and trying to do what's well beyond us and destroying our own lives? And now I'm thinking, you know, this Pandora story has just got some real teeth to it that I never in my entire life until last week understood was part of that story. I mean, I've known the story of Pandora since I was in elementary school, but man, did I miss this whole level of meaning in it that to the Greeks would have been obvious. You know, from a slave all the way up to the most powerful Greek, they all would have said, "Oh God, there's Elpis in the chest." And meanwhile, all the moderns are going, "No, it's hope." This is what I mean about language and how difficult it is to understand each other. When you come from different worldviews, you interpret everything in completely different ways to the point that the meaning of the story can be completely inverted without us ever realizing that we're misunderstanding. It's the power of a worldview. So, Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I actually think that this is a very important point, and all the examples that you've given are very helpful. In the sense, hope in particular, obviously, I mean, hope is often seen as, you know, as a good thing, and it is better than despair. So there is that nuance to say, but there is also, it is often a response to fear. And that fear is something that we then fail to confront. And so just like you were talking about, if we get what we want all the time, and how that we, what was it? You said something along the lines of that. Well, we don't necessarily appreciate what tragedy is, you know, and so, but these ideas that we're talking about, whether it be hope, whether it be eros and love, and what the meaning is behind all these things, they're very nuanced. And they're much deeper concepts than we make them out to be. And I think, again, just coming back to the whole idea of hope, is it does give us in the modern context, gives us a complete perverted perspective on reality, in the sense that, you know, that we're attaching our hopes to our desires and our immediate desires. And those immediate desires are often not necessarily correctly aimed. And so we're hoping for something that's not even necessarily helpful. And then, and we're hoping, and that because it's linked to our desires, it's almost, that's where we're just avoiding our fears as opposed to confronting our fears. But in it, the more important point is to understand that there is a lot more nuance that's related to all these concepts, and that we've distorted that. And I think that that's, you know, and that also comes from over-categorization as well. So anyway.
Thanks, Joe. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was just going to say that today you have the beautiful example of the conflict between two sides in the Republicans and the Democrats, which is starting to look like it's going to be bloodthirsty. And what went wrong with the Greeks? Here you are. Here's your opportunity. Is there an easy answer? And I would say, well, no, the answer doesn't seem to be easy. It seems like both sides are very passionately opposed. I think the next excellent example, you take the history of the Vikings. They have votes, and it's so obvious in these stories about the Vikings why they have a vote. The other choice was that the two warring tribes would try to kill each other and winner takes all. They thought, well, we'll save a few deaths by simply having the vote and the majority takes all. Because the excellent case was, Maxine Waters, she stands up in front of a crowd somewhere and says, we're not going to accept this. I want you to harass them when they're out to lunch. I want you to harass them when they're in their private home. In other words, Maxine Waters just completely overturns the principle which the Vikings exhibited. How do we not kill each other? Well, we respect social boundaries. That we'll find another way of doing things, and the other way is just accepting the outcome of the vote. But see, what's happened now in America is both parties are not going to accept the outcome of a vote.
Well, and we tamper with the vote, which increases the chances that the other side won't accept the vote. And then we don't see that that's the outcome, and we can't see the vicious cycle that we're caught in.
People have been tampering with the votes, you think?
Yep, for a long time in the United States, we've been tampering with our votes. And everybody, we pretend sometimes that it's a perfect, pure process. But when push comes to shove, especially if we lost an election we wanted to win, then the truth comes out and people admit to themselves, well, we know people have been tampering with. Now, previously, we could pretend that when we were winning, nobody was tampering with the votes. But now that we're losing, now we're angry that other people are tampering with the votes. So
do you think that's how Trump won in 2016 because it was tampered? That's how he won, do you think?
Well, actually, I want to set aside current events. I mean, Major Daley in Chicago is famous for being caught with his hand in the ballot box. It's been going on for ages. Kennedy won in part because his dad was working with the mafia. I mean, this is well documented. This isn't conspiracy theory. He had mafia connections, and they tampered with the vote all over the damn place. So Democrats do it, Republicans do it. Everybody's been doing it in this country for a long time. I think even in the 18th century and 19th century, we can find examples of vote tampering in the US.
Yeah, because it boggles my mind how Trump won in 2016. It must have been tampered with. That's how he won. I really do think. Yeah.
Well, regardless, let's set aside modern stuff because we've got to wrap up today anyway. So I want to actually thank you, Steve.
Grab that pitchfork now.
That's right. So thank you for bringing that up, Stephen. I want to call on Sharon, and I got one last thing to say, and we'll wrap up for today. So come off mute, Sharon. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I want to go back to that subject of hope, Elpis, because I like it. Because in the profession in which I practice, in which I lived my whole life, hope is a very, very important entity. It's got a duality. Functionally, it's got a duality, and it's got a spectrum. And hope is power, but you got to know when it has lost its power and be able to transmit the information accurately to allow the patient to move to the next phase. And so hope is a very, 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 very powerful tool, but it's got to be used correctly. And I just wanted to say that hope, it's not the opposite of despair. Sometimes when you give up on hope, then despair sets in, and all depends on how you view the terminality. But hope is a very, 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 very powerful tool.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for saying that, Sharon. It's critically important in medicine. And in medicine, it's a classic example. You've got people who give up hope, who could make it if they're just willing to, exert themselves to go through the protocol of treatment. They could make it out the other end, but they give up too early because they don't have hope. So I know in medicine, there's a strong awareness of the critical role, but we also see in medicine the exact opposite. We see people who have no hope, but when they hear the statistics, 99% chance of failure, 1% chance of success, they're like, well, then I'll keep fighting. And then they bankrupt themselves and their entire family over something that was going to fail anyway. And they spend their entire time hooked up to tubes when they could have gone home and spent their last weeks, with their loved ones. And this is that duality you're talking about. It's about, do you know yourself? Do you know your situation? Do you understand the season that you're in? Can you use your tools like hope correctly? Or do they possess you and you just become a slave to them one way or the other?
Correct.
And this is the issue the Greeks are worried about. So what I want to wrap up with is this Kenneth Smith quote. Next week we get to go on to paragraph 12. We're done with paragraph 11 now. We've dealt with the issue of idiocy. But this Kenneth Smith quote is from a published book of his called Otherwise. It's parable number 98. And it goes, Kafka said he was permitted to attain the Archimedean standpoint only on the condition he use it against himself. And this isn't from one of his stories. This is from one of his notebooks, one of the Blue Octavo notebooks. And I think I've mentioned this one before. I never understood it. For like 15 years, I didn't understand why Kenneth put this in there. What is this doing in there? It just sounds sort of like mean, right? First of all, it's confusing because I didn't know what the Archimedean standpoint was.
Yes.
And then when I learned what it was, I thought it was mean. The Archimedean standpoint, Archimedes has invented a lot of simple machines that physics we teach people in elementary school. Basically.
Density.
The lever, the pulley, the ramp, the screw. And it's in reference to the lever. And he says the principle of the lever is so powerful that with a long enough lever and the right fulcrum and standpoint, you could move the world. This is Archimedes' famous statement. And he's right. With a long enough lever and the right standpoint, you could move the planet Earth if it were stationary, which it isn't. But let's imagine that it was stationary, because that's the power of the multiplication of energy that happens across a lever when it's positioned correctly. It's got the right fulcrum and so forth. So the Archimedean standpoint is, where do you have to be standing to get the leverage that you need? That's the Archimedean standpoint. And Kafka's saying that this person that he's talking about was permitted to get that standpoint, but only on the condition to use it against himself. I thought, oh, Kafka's just being Kafka again. He's just being a downer. He's just being depressing. You only get to have this power if you use it against yourself. But I eventually came to understand this is the definition of an aristos, or a philosopher. The wise person, the person genuinely in pursuit of wisdom, who's authentically working towards it, is only the person who uses their powers to overcome their own manias, to overcome their own desires, to overcome their own ideologies, to escape the labyrinth that they're trapped in. Because if you're not doing that, you're a complete idiot. You're a double idiot, like we were talking about earlier. You both have the legacy of idiocy that we're born into as Homo sapiens, and you have the additional idiocy of the majority of people who cling to their idiocy as though it's a virtue, who think being overconfident, over-desiring, who want to push their views on everybody else, who can't hear a dissenting opinion without wanting to argue with it because they have to be right and everybody has to think like they do. That genocidal impulse to spread oneself across the entire world and purify it and make it a reflection of yourself, using Phil's, Narcissus thing. There is a vanity and an egotism to that, such that it's such a tragic condition. It guarantees such a tragic outcome that it doesn't matter how many other virtues you have. The Greeks say, if you have this, you can have all the other virtues and it will still come out a tragedy for you, because you insist on using your gifts against others and to self-aggrandize. But conversely, if you have the wisdom to understand that you have to deal with your issues, your baggage, the problems that you bring to the situation, and you can keep that focus, well, then you've got a lever to move the world. Because finally, you've got the capacity to overcome the main source of your problems, which is yourself. You're no longer necessarily setting yourselves up for tragedy. Your agency now can actually be a strength instead of a weakness. If you don't know yourself, if you don't know these liabilities you have, then to be a strong man is to be a man bound for tragedy, because you will use your strength in the wrong ways. A strong man who doesn't have the skepticism about his own character and the discipline to deal with it is a weak man. Paradoxical.
Yes.
How
And a
dare
weak-
you speak against the power of positive thinking?
Yes, this is what I'm doing. I'm speaking. I saw this stuff come up in the chat, and I have to say the issue of strength and weakness can't be clearly talked about outside the context of whether you are self-skeptical, whether you are using the Archimedean standpoint against yourself. If you are not doing those things, you're no philosopher and you're a double idiot. The only way to reduce yourself from a double idiot to a simple single level idiot, which we're born into as Homo sapiens, is if you are self-skeptical, i.e. weak from the modern perspective. You've got to be able to question yourself in order to have any true strength in the world. So this is the paradox of character that's being talked about in these paragraphs. And next week, we'll pick it up with paragraph 12. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. See you next week.
Thanks, Rick.
Yeah.
Bye, Rick. Bye, Joe. Bye, Phil.
Hey, Donald, I bought a book based on your recommendation. Now I feel like an idiot. You said anybody that listens to you feel.
Yeah, probably.
Have a
Anyway.
great week.